Breathe in. Breathe out. Slowly breathe. No, don't do it that way. We're not gasping for air. Well, I hope everyone rested well. I tell you, I slept well, and I'm really, really excited about today. I spent a lot of time this morning praying for a lot of things in regards to today. One, and I really appreciated Michael's prayer. I do always pray that I have the wisdom to say the right things that are going to really help and that will be beneficial to you as a congregation and work. But I spent some time this morning praying specifically for you and about your creativity and about the things that you need and the things that you're going to develop as you think about your vision statement and what that's going to look like and how that's going to help this congregation. So I'm really excited about that. I always love to see how God works through you to accomplish those things. And so I'm excited about today. As I mentioned, I'm going to start here. I'm not sure how these colors are going to show up on this screen and the words that are within the blocks we're going to talk about. But I'm going to tell you what's there so that if you can't see them or they don't come through real well, I'll be able to explain to you what we're looking at. About 18 months ago, I started working on some material that at the time I didn't think of it from the standpoint of it becoming a book, but it ultimately became a book that's about to be published. But it was this idea, initially, I wanted to call it the Navigator. You know, last night we had this list of all these terms that we use to describe a leader or to define leadership in general. Welcome. And so, as I was doing some research, what was interesting to me was that I never found on Google, I did this research, I was looking for synonyms to the idea of a leader. And I never did see the word navigator. There's CEO, there's boss, there's commander, there's chief, I mean all these executive terms. But I never did find anything that said navigator. And I thought, isn't that what a leader does? I mean, they're a navigator. They're navigating through those difficult times because it doesn't take much leadership when everything is good. When everything's moving in a positive direction and going the way that we want it to, it doesn't take much leadership to continue to keep that moving. The challenge is when difficulty comes, when there's conflict, when there's controversy. That's when things change. That's when we need a navigator, someone who knows how to navigate through those challenging waters. And so I thought this would be a cool idea for a book. I was going to call it The Navigator. So I wrote some of the material and I sent it to a guy and he said, don't call it Navigator. I was like, okay, why? And so anyway, he had seen the presentation and he kind of knew the material that I'm about to share with you. He said, you need to call it something else. So I wrote the book. The book is called Zone Leader. 7 Tactics for Leading in the Zones. And I'll tell you more about it in just a second. But I still go back to the navigator piece because I love that. And for me, in the church, we need to know how to navigate the church in today's culture. The culture of the world that we live in today is far different than the culture that most of us grew up in. It's far different. I mean, I don't even know that there's such polar opposite. I mean, I grew up in a culture where we never locked our doors. We didn't lock the doors of our car. We didn't lock the doors of our house. I mean, we played in the neighborhood. Parents never had a clue where we were at. I mean, we were just out playing. But the world today is so different. I mean, I guess someone stole the catalytic converter off the rental car. I don't know. When I started it up this morning, it sure sounded different than it did yesterday when I drove it. And so something's happened. I don't know what it is, but I guess they'll figure it out when I take it back to the rental car company. But it sounds more like a beach dune buggy or something. I don't know. It doesn't sound the same as it did yesterday. Well, and I think that's kind of what's happened in the church. We're trying to live in the past, but we're not in the past anymore. Things have changed. And so now we're trying to figure out how do we navigate this time of change, the church, in today's culture. Part of the issue is we're in what I refer to as, and I knew the colors were going to show up pretty weak, but the comfort zone. I call it the comfort zone. Everybody's familiar with your comfort zone, right? I mean, this is a place where we're safe and we feel like we're in control. This is really what we would consider to be normal. Over the last 2 years, how many times have you heard people say, we just want things to go back to normal? Yeah. I mean, really, this COVID pandemic has really wrecked our concept, our whole world. And we just want things to go back to normal. Because normal for us is where we feel safe and where we're in control. That's our comfort zone. It's also a place that's very familiar and predictable. Familiar because form and function remains the same, and predictable because it never changes. And so that's our world. We like the comfort zone because we're familiar with it. It's predictable. We know what's going to happen because it's the way we've always done it. But this is life in the rut, if you will. Now, I grew up in southern Missouri, northern Arkansas, and I found a lot of my time down old country dirt roads. And if you've ever been on a country dirt road, and I'm sure most of you have, you know that after a good hard rain, the first vehicle down that road leaves ruts. And when the sun bakes those ruts, it's very difficult to drive on that road. And if your tires are in the rut, they're pretty comfortable. But trying to get out of that rut requires some strength and a little bit of risk. Because it might jerk the car out of that rut into oncoming traffic. It may push it off the road. I mean, there's just a lot of challenges to that. The biggest piece for me when it comes to this idea of the comfort zone is the fact that there's no risk. That's why we like it. Now, I'll be the first to tell you, you talked about not liking change, and I'll be the first to tell you, I love my comfort zone. I get up at the same time every day. I usually at home eat the same breakfast every day. I have the same routine that I practice every day. I usually eat the same meal for lunch every day, and I go to bed at the same time every night. I have a routine, and I love it. It works for me. But the thing is, when I travel, that routine gets kind of mixed up. We don't have the same breakfast. We don't have the same lunch, and that's okay. But just a 1 hour time change, every spring and every fall. You know, we do that daylight saving thing. We can thank Benjamin Franklin for that. 238 years ago, he introduced this thing we call daylight saving time. Do you know why that was introduced? Well, there wasn't electricity 238 years ago. We didn't have electricity. You know, I've always heard that. I always heard it was farmers. You know, they needed more time for their harvesting and things. But that wasn't the reason he introduced it. He introduced it to save candles. Candles. Because if you're burning candles, those things cost money. And so in order to have more daylight and save money on burning candles, he introduced this concept of daylight saving time. Now, 238 years later, with the advent of electricity, we're still doing this same process that was started more than 2 centuries ago. Why? Because change is difficult. Now, I'll tell you, every year in the spring and in the fall, it takes me a week to get my sleep pattern adjusted. Because I don't like that change. And why do we continue to do it? The reason for which it started no longer exists. But we continue to do it because we're comfortable. That's what we've always done. And even though we don't like it, we continue to do it. Now, I have heard that there's been some legislation presented to our government to try to do away with that. I would love that. Make it one or the other. I don't care. Just do it. But that's not for me to decide. But in the church, it's the same thing. We're in a comfort zone. And anytime you try to bring about some kind of change, people get a little antsy. And we're going to talk more about that in just a moment. And here's what happens. The moment you introduce change, you're going to enter into what I call the combat zone. Because you're going to deal with resistance. People are very resistant to change. They don't want it. They don't like it. They're afraid of it. And it creates conflict. Now, there are two types of conflict. One is forced, I'm assuming that came up, forced conflict, and there is initiated conflict. Now, let me explain the difference. Forced conflict takes place when you're not prepared for it. You weren't expecting it. And obviously, initiated conflict is different because it's about being prepared for it and you are anticipating it. It's expected. So change, which is introduced, that brings about this resistance and this conflict, I'll tell you, the biggest forced conflict that I know of is COVID-19. That forced us as the church into things and into an arena that we did not expect and we were not prepared for. And it changed everything. It changed the way that we meet. It changed the way we take the Lord's Supper. It changed the way we give. Churches who believed that it was unscriptural to have online giving, the minute COVID-19 hit, it was like, how quickly can we get something online so that people can give? I mean, it just blew my mind how everything changed for us in a moment. I mean, we're still dealing with the effects of it. Mask, no mask. Vaccine, no vaccine. I mean, the discussion and the argument and the conflict that has resulted from a virus is baffling to me. That's forced conflict. We didn't expect it, weren't prepared for it, nobody could have predicted it, and what we thought initially was going to take maybe a week or two ended up being now 2.5 years later. And we're still dealing with all the variants of COVID-19. What's interesting to me is it's not the only form of forced conflict, if you will. I mean, there are other things that take place that people are not expecting, they're not prepared for, that force them into a situation of conflict. It can be a tornado that comes through, natural disasters, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, flooding. I mean, we have dealt with in this country so many different ways that people are forced into conflict because they weren't expecting and they weren't prepared for it. And so that happens. We also see forced conflict in situations where people are diagnosed with terminal illness or there's an accident. I mean, and the list goes on of those types of things that we're not expecting, we're not prepared for, and they happen, and it forces a situation of conflict. Now, initiated conflict is totally different. Because initiated conflict takes place when people are prepared and they are expecting this change to come. Now, I'll tell you, the major difference between these two things and how we can minimize the conflict and the resistance that comes, that produces the conflict, is really summed up in one very simple word, and that's communication. Communication. Now, communication was a premium, wasn't it, when we first heard about COVID-19? How many of you walked away from the television set those first few weeks? I mean, we're watching the news every minute to try to figure out what is going to happen, what's coming next, how's this going to affect us long term. I mean, we listened because communication was premium. The problem was we were getting such different reports from all these various sources, nobody knew what to believe. Now, I find it fascinating that perspective makes all the difference between forced and initiated conflict. Because what often happens on one hand is we think we're initiating the change and the conflict so that we can move in a certain direction, but the people that it's being initiated on feel like it's forced on them. And a part of that all goes back to communication. Now, I'm going to talk more about communication in just a few moments, but I just want you to know that that's the key word that separates these two things. Forced and initiated conflict, it's communication. Now, when conflict enters into the picture, either way, forced or initiated, there's an element of fear. People are afraid because it deals with some element of insecurity. There is an element of uncertainty, instability, the unknown. I mean, people are just unaware of what's happening. Part of that fear exists because of the lack of communication or ineffective communication. But fear is a real thing, and people get a bit afraid when we're talking about implementing change. But here's the biggest piece. When leaders do not communicate effectively the changes that are coming, why we're making this change, how we're making this change, what this change looks like, who's going to be involved in this change, and so on, then what results is a lack of trust in our leadership. You see that on a political level, you see that on a corporate level, and you're going to see it on a religious level. When the communication does not exist, or ineffective communication exists, then the result ultimately will lead to this idea of a lack of trust in our leadership. And that becomes very challenging. Now, what happens here is very significant. Because if the conflict is great enough, then what happens is we go right back into our comfort zone. People don't want to deal with controversy. They don't want to deal with conflict. They don't want to deal with challenge. And so when people get resistant, if they raise enough resistance and conflict, then leaders oftentimes are like, it's not worth it. Let's just go back to doing things the way that we've always done them, because that's where we are comfortable. And that's the wrong thing to do. But oftentimes, that's what I've seen take place, especially in the church. I was going to try to bring about some things to change. People didn't like it, and the elders were like, it's not worth it. Let's not fight this battle. Let's just go back to doing things the way we've always done them. And what happens is when we continue to do things in the same ways that we've always done them, we're going to get the same results that we've always got. You can't continue to do the same things in the same ways and expect different results. That's called insanity. It doesn't work. Now, there's another piece here that I think is very important for us to think about, and that is, if we're not careful, we can get into what I call a danger zone. Now, the danger zone is a place that usually results from forced conflict. When elders get into a situation and they're dealing with conflict of a certain nature, they can get into this danger zone. I spent some time the first part of 2021, about a year and a half ago. I interviewed somewhere around 12 or 13, I don't remember the exact number now, elders across the country. And I interviewed elders that came from East Coast, West Coast, from the north to the south, congregations of 80 to congregations of 800. I wanted to get such a wide perspective from these men as to how things were working for them in the congregation. How were they staying connected to the congregation? How were they keeping the congregation connected to each other? How were they staying connected to each other as elders? How were they communicating? What were the results of the COVID pandemic? I just asked a lot of different questions. All those interviews are on the website at Sunset, at the SALT website, and I'll give you more information about that later. But all those interviews are on that website. You can listen to those and hear about the information. But the one thing that was consistent through all these men that I talked to is they were overwhelmed. They were worn out, burned out, fatigued, stressed to the max, because every decision that they had been making for the past year in 2020 was only 50% right. Congregations were so divided over this pandemic. The mask, no mask rule. I mean, if they made the decision to say everybody's going to wear a mask, half the congregation said we're not coming. And if they made the decision to say no mask, the other half of the congregation said they weren't coming. And it was just this continual battle and the conflict that they were having to deal with. That's why they wanted to go back to normal. They just wanted to go back to doing things the way that they wanted to do them. And whoever invented that styrofoam piece for unleavened bread should be shot. Because I'm here to tell you that's the nastiest thing I've ever put in my mouth. Please tell me y'all don't use that. Oh, we're going to have a talk tomorrow.
Change, brother.
Change. I'm telling you, that's not unleavened bread. I've eaten styrofoam cups that tasted better than that. Those things are horrible. And for people who think we shouldn't have alcoholic content in the fruit of the vine, you can't tell me there's not alcohol content. That's like drinking NyQuil. I mean, that stuff is horrible. I mean, I take it and go, I mean, it's just so. I mean, they leave it sitting out here in the warm. It's going to ferment, Anyway, let me get myself. Am I preaching your language? I'm telling you what, those things are horrible. But here's the thing. These leaders in the church and in our world and in the educational system, the list goes on and on. They've gotten into this danger zone because they are so stressed. And they are tired. They're fatigued to the max. And burnout, if you will. But some of the worst part of this is the relational tension that has resulted. One of my favorite congregations on the planet is the Manford Church of Christ in Manford, Oklahoma. Those three men are some of the best elders I've ever met in my life. They are awesome. And they're best friends. They meet for about 20 hours a month. They meet all the time. They do things together. They're in each other's homes. They go on road trips together. I mean, they just love being together because they're best friends. And during this pandemic, I interviewed one of those elders, and he was telling me about some of the relational tension they had started experiencing among themselves. And I said, that's this pandemic. You guys are stressed, overwhelmed. I mean, they just really struggled with how to make the decisions and what to do and how to move forward through all of this stuff. And so, the sad part is that when that kind of relational tension exists, leaders get into what I call becoming a sideline leader. They're not out in front leading anymore. They're kind of a spectator. They're on the side or they're in the rear. And they're just observing what's taking place. They're not really leading. They're just trying to make sure that nothing changes. And that sideline leadership is damaging. And it's harmful to a congregation. Leaders must lead. They've got to be out in front. And they've got to show the way. They've got to go the way. They've got to be the ones who are helping others understand this is the path. And sometimes they have to make decisions that are not going to get 100% approval. But they still have to make the decision. The church has been guided for far too long by this fear of someone leaving. And we got to stop that. I know the church in Virginia Beach, they started meeting in the home when the pandemic hit, and they really liked the house church model. They were renting a facility. And so when the pandemic hit, they couldn't meet in that facility because it wasn't big enough for all 50 of them to get in. So they started doing house church. Well, the younger generation really liked it. They really liked the house church model. So they stayed with it. They let the lease go on the building, which was $2,000 a month, which they couldn't afford. So they let that go and they just kept meeting in the home. Well, a couple of the older members said, no, we're not going to do that. And so they got into this stressful situation of trying to decide, what do we do? And I said to them, they're not leaving the Lord. They're going to go somewhere else. Tell them it's okay. Love you, want you to stay. Want you to be a part of this because this is the direction we're going to go. But this may not be the fit for you. We'll pray for you. But if you feel like you can better serve over here, then go over there. But this is what we believe is going to be best. And that's what they did. You know, the interesting thing is, a couple of folks did go to another congregation. But some of the others said, you know, this really is a good thing. Let's make this work. So they did. Now, my experience has been that when change is introduced, the people who tend to become the most resistant usually are people that, one, either have money, or two, they have an extreme amount of talent. And so if they don't like the change, they start going to the leadership and saying, hey, we don't like this. And if you do this, we're going to go somewhere else. And elders become afraid because they're a pretty big giver. And so they don't make the change to accommodate the one person. When that happens, the minority are ruling. And when the minority rules, and they tend to know that they rule, they're going to dictate every decision that they don't like. As long as they agree with it, everything's good. But if they don't like with it, they're going to buck the system. And they're going to come in and they're going to complain and they're going to threaten. And every time we allow them to threaten, we're giving them more power. My thing is, why are you a leader? Let them be the leader. But see, they don't want to do that. They would rather control it from behind the scenes. And we've got to stop that. It is killing us. I can't even tell you how many times I've seen this in the church, where one individual controls the decisions that are made, and he's not a leader. But the leaders that he is bending their ear are listening to that voice instead of the 99 others who are saying we need to move in this direction. The church becomes stagnant, and as a result, they do not move and they ultimately die. I worked with a congregation in Louisiana, and when I met with them and talked to them, they didn't have elders. They had about 2 or 3 men that were qualified. They wanted to appoint as elders, but they had 1, maybe 2, older gentlemen that did not want elders. And they threatened that if you appoint those men as elders, we're leaving. And so they asked me what to do. I said, appoint them. If they're qualified, appoint them. And tell those 2 men, if they want to leave, there's the door. You know what? They didn't leave. See, a lot of times we allow these bullies in a congregation to threaten and control the direction of the congregation because they want to control it. In a men's business meeting, they have the control. Well, guess what? A men's business meeting is not a biblical model.
Amen.
We don't have that. You don't read that in Scripture. God appointed certain people to lead in His church, and there's a reason why they lead. And if we don't do that, we end up in this danger zone. Sorry you can't read the print there. I told you everything was on it. But the thing is, we get into this danger zone where these challenges exist in the church. Ultimately, what happens is, from the danger zone, they go right back into the comfort zone. And we just wait for our own funeral. Now, ultimately, where we want to get to is we want to get to the end zone. Now, I use this terminology because I love football. And in the book, I wrote a big section about football. And how the end zone actually came about, and actually how the whole sport of football evolved from a combination of soccer and rugby. And so I had that section in there, but the end zone represents a special place for me. Because the end zone is the place where we get to recover. You know, when you've been through the combat zone, and you've experienced all these challenges, you get to a place where you need to recover. You need to heal, and you need to form new direction. Because if you're not careful, the end zone can become the new comfort zone. You know, you experience this success, and when you have that success and that achievement, what happens is you start thinking, let's just keep doing this, it's working. And it evolves into becoming the new comfort zone. You can't do that. You can't rest here very long. You recover, you heal, and you form new direction. This is the place where you evaluate what you've done, what worked, what didn't work, how do we improve on that, how do we strengthen, stretch our leadership, how do we perfect our leadership. You see, this is where we get the opportunity to really look to the future. And how do we continue to build on what's taken place to get us here so that we can move forward to even greater success. Now, the way that happens is what I call the 7 tactics of leading in the zones. This strategy, and I'm going to share a couple of those pieces with you later. We don't have enough time because it would be all day going through all 7 of them. But I am going to share a couple of the 2 most important ones that I think exist when it comes to the church. So I'm going to talk about those in just a little bit. But I want to spend some time, and this is what I promised you, is I want to talk about this idea of change. So here's what we're going to do. How do people respond to change? Change is what's going to happen in order for the church to move forward. But how are people going to respond to change? Say it again.
Rebel.
Rebel. Sometimes they are going to rebel. It happens. How else?
Kind of selective about what they don't mind being changing and other things they don't want to change.
It's like you read my book. You know, isn't that really true? I find it so fascinating that people are so resistant to some kinds of change, but they're totally open to other kinds of change. They're kind of selective. I don't mind this change, but I don't like this change. You know, I think it's funny to me in the political system of our country, we kind of accept change. If we're a Democrat and there is a Republican in office, then when a Democrat is elected, we're all for that change. And if you're a Republican and there's a Democrat in office, when that changes and there's a Republican in office, then you like that change. I mean, don't we even like environmental change? I mean, after a long hot summer, don't you welcome the change of fall? The cooler temperatures? And if you've had a harsh winter that's really cold, don't you kind of welcome the spring and things start coming to life? I mean, we welcome environmental change. And I tell you what, financially, I've never met a person yet that when the boss came in and said, we're going to give you a raise, said, oh, no, I can't take that kind of change. You're going to make my life financially better? I can't take change. We're not having change here. I've never met anybody that did that. But you try to take it away, then there's going to be some change. There's going to be some conflict that comes from that. I mean, there are some things that we're kind of, this change is okay, this change is not okay. I mean, I'll have to tell you that biologically, when my children started growing up, I was thankful that they learned how to dress themselves, how to go to the bathroom by themselves, and how to learn to feed themselves. That was the kind of change I was pretty glad to see happen. But as I'm getting older and I'm starting to feel those creaks in my joints, I'm not so sure that that kind of change I'm welcoming. I mean, my dad used to tell me, son, this getting old ain't all it's cracked up to be. And I thought, okay. But my favorite thing he used to say is, you got to be tough to get old. And I thought, okay, I'm kind of on the front end of that, but I've kind of figured it out. But the thing is, there are some things that we are welcoming when it comes to change and other things that we're kind of resistant to. Spiritually speaking, this is the one that cracks me up the most. We are so resistant to change when it comes to the church, and yet we preach it every single Sunday. We just use a different word. You know what the word is? What's the word we use? We don't call it change, we call it what? Have you not taught them what this word means here, Michael?
What word we look
Repent! Repent! I mean, and the funny thing is that I don't use that word in my everyday language, English, I've never told my wife, I was thinking about going downtown, but I repented. I mean, who does that? We don't speak that way. But somehow we get into this auditorium and it's like we don't tell people to change, we tell them to repent. But isn't that what repentance means? Change. You got to change your mind. You got to change your actions. You got to make change in your life. But it's funny to me how that works. Repent. Oh, I love it. How else do people respond to change?
Kind of the same as rebel, but negatively.
Yeah, they get pretty negative about it. And the worst part about negativity is it spreads like wildfire. Because I'm not going to come to you as a leader. I'm going to go to you as my friend. And I'm going to get pretty negative about this change. I mean, really, where do they get the gall of being able to make that kind of change? I mean, who gave them the information to make that decision? Why did they come to that conclusion? We ask all kinds of questions and we start spreading this negativity. And it becomes this wildfire that grows in the church. Next thing you know, you got a coup on your hands. How else do people respond to change?
Adapt.
Ah. How old are you?
39.
There you go. See, here's a guy that's in the middle of all of this. He's kind of accepting of some change. You got to adapt. Change, I'm assuming that. But the thing is you adapt to it. I mean, when you had children in your family, don't you learn to adapt to that change? Daily. Isn't that the truth, though? I mean, and when they become teenagers, you got to really be willing to adapt. Because that's a whole different ballgame. So you have to adapt. How else? How else do people respond to change? I like that. I've never had that word. I like that one. Adapt.
I think hesitate.
Ooh, very good. Yes.
Hesitant.
They hesitate. It's not that they're necessarily against the change. They're just hesitant because not sure. There's some uncertainty, maybe a little bit of fear. Are you familiar with that, they call it the bell curve, where you have these early adopters? There's some people that when you start implementing change, they're so quick to get on board. They're like, the new iPhone 14's out, let me get it. And I'm like, who in their right mind spend $1,200 for my phone? I mean, I've still got an iPhone 8. And, it works for me. My grandson, the other day, he's like, Grandpa, he said, you got to upload the new iOS 16. And I'm like, okay, I guess so. And so he showed me how to get to it, and I uploaded that. And he was trying to show me what it would do, and he goes, "What model is your phone?" I said, "It's an 8. He goes, "Well, your phone won't do what mine does." And I'm like, that's the way it works. But there are people who are early adopters. There are some that they're going to wait. They're hesitant to jump on board right off when something new comes out. They're going to sit back and they're going to wait and see. Is it going to work? Is it going to be effective? And so what's interesting is that this section right here is about 68% of the people. You got about 68% of the people who are going to be hesitant to jump on board. They're going to wait. They want to see, is it going to work? If it works, then they're going to come along and they're going to get on board. And, you know, I heard this statement made one time that I really like. It's not that people hate change. They hate the way we try to change them. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. It's not that they hate change. It's just that they hate the way we try to change them. And I'm going to talk some more about that in just a moment. Any other ideas as to...
About stop doing things.
They're just going to stop. They're just going to stop. Not going to do it. Not going to happen. I'm not going to do it. How else? How else do they respond? Any other ideas?
Hopefully positive.
I wondered if I would get that. Some people are very accepting of change. And they're very positive about it because they can see that it's a good thing. If we do this, this is going to be a positive thing. I like those folks. They're positive. Any other ideas? Well, let me share you this. It's Tom Peters credits Kevin Kelly for making this statement that it's easier to kill an organization than it is to change it. It's a pretty significant statement. And Tom Peters went on to say this: "We must simply learn to love change as much as we have hated it in the past. Today, loving change, tumult, even chaos is a prerequisite for survival, let alone for success." You know when he made that statement? In the late 1970s. Yeah, 50 years ago. Can you imagine? And how things have changed since then. I mean, when we think about it, I like Malcolm Weber, who said, "No change means no growth, and no growth means death. It takes more energy to maintain the status quo than to use change as a source of energy and fruitfulness." Isn't that an interesting thought? And really true. Tony Richards said that change has to be intentional for positive transformation, not change for change's sake. Now, I'll be the first to tell you that if you're just wanting to make change to say that you made change, it's wrong. That's not what we're talking about here. The idea of change has to be for positive transformation. Now, there are really two types of change, if you will. There's incremental change and there's transformational change. And what we've done in the past is we've kind of approached things incrementally than transformational. And in the incremental change, it's like we're going to move like a half a tick on the clock. I mean, so much so that you're not really even sure that change was made. And in another year or so, we'll do the other half of the tick. By the time we get around to making any significant difference, I'm going to be gone. And others will have to deal with it. And so it's like that incremental change is not always good. Now, incremental change can be good, and we should use it in certain situations. The transformational change needs to be positive. It needs to be that we're looking at this from the standpoint of something that's going to be very good. I talked about politically, how that we are accepting that, environmentally, the idea physically, and as well financially. But somehow when it comes to spiritually, we tend to say no when it comes to change. So why is it so difficult? I came across this article by Charles Stone called 8 Reasons Why Church Change is So Difficult. And I'm not going to share all 8 of the reasons. I'm just going to share a few of them with you because I think they're the most relevant. Number 1 is we tend to assume the worst. That's our normal default. Our default switch is that when somebody talks about bringing change, our automatic response is that it's going to be the worst. I met with a group of elders, I'm not going to tell you where, but it was in Texas. But I met with this group of elders, there were 8 of them. And I kind of go through this material on change, and I'm telling them all about change, and I just use the word change a lot. Finally, this one elder, he got red in the face. He said, I wish you would stop using that word. And I said, why? Because every time you use it, I think we're going liberal. I'm like, why do you think that? Now, granted, I'll be the first to tell you as well that I don't think all change is good. There have been a lot of churches in the brotherhood that started making change, and they did go liberal. I mean, they brought in a band or a piano, and they got women in the pulpit preaching. I'm not talking about those kinds of change. I'm not talking about changing God's Word. I'm not talking about changing our practice. I'm talking about the type of presentation, the methodology, the delivery system, maybe even the time in which we meet. I'm talking about change that can be positive to bring about growth. And let me tell you, you will a piano in here, you're not going to have growth. That's not going to happen. That's not the type of change that brings growth. That brings division. That's not what I'm talking about. I don't agree with that, and nor would I support it. So I just want to put your minds at ease that when I talk about change, that's not what I'm talking about. But I'm telling you, if we don't repent, and if we don't start making some change when it comes to our delivery and our methodology, then we're going to be in trouble. We talked the other night over at Johnny's house, talked about the idea, how do kids in the educational system of our country, what do they use to learn? Repetition. Say, there we go. Phones. Kids all have iPhones, they have computers, they have laptops, they have tablets. That's what they're learning on. And then they come to the church building and they get coloring pages and flannel graph. Now guess which one's going to be the most interesting for them? So if we're still delivering the message doesn't change, but if we're still delivering the message through flannel graph and coloring pages, then those kids are checked out before they even get started. They're like, this is boring. And what happens is they see the church as outdated, outmoded, irrelevant, and really not keeping up with the times. And so they want nothing to do with it. Now, I haven't talked about changing the message, but could we use television, laptops, computers, iPhones? Can we use those types of tools technologically to improve the way we deliver the message? Yeah. And let me tell you, we're going to have to. Because if we don't make that kind of change, then what's going to happen is our kids are checked out. They're going to go somewhere else that does. Now, I have a very good friend of mine who preached for a church in Oklahoma City for a number of years. He's now in Houston. But Craig Rochelle has a church, and I can't think of the name of it. I want to say it's Life Church, but that may not be it. But it's a church that has like 10,000 plus members. They got satellite campuses all over the country. But they have about 10,000 members there in Oklahoma City. They have like 5 or 6 different services every Sunday. They have to have police to navigate the traffic. And so this friend of mine, after a Sunday morning worship service with the congregation, decided to go over and find out what they were doing. He wanted to find out, why is this so attracting to people? Why are people going there? And he said, I listened to the music, and he said, it was too loud. He said, I didn't see people going. He said, nobody was really engaged in what was going on. He said, the sermon, this guy was a homiletics teacher, so he was kind of like, it just really wasn't that good. He said, it wasn't bad, it just wasn't that good. And he said, really, I was trying to figure out, what is it that these people are coming for? And he said, and then he noticed, everything they did was geared towards kids. Everything. The minute those kids got out of the car, to the minute they got back in it, everything that was there was structured towards those kids. And I thought, we're going to have to ask ourselves, who are we really trying to reach? Are we trying to only reach people who are like us? Are we trying to reach kids? Families, young families with kids? Because if we're trying to reach young families with kids, we certainly can't continue to do things the way we've been doing them. Because they're not going to sit and listen to a 30-minute sermon. Sorry, Mom. But they're not going to listen to a 30-minute sermon. They just aren't. I met with a congregation in Piketon, Ohio, and they're the only congregation really that I know of that grew the way that they did during the pandemic. They started out pre-pandemic with 10 people. Now, if you've never been to Piketon, Ohio, it's like stepping back in time 25 or 30 years. They started with 10 people. They had 10 people that were meeting in a building. Big building. They hired this young preacher, had no education, no training. I mean, he's not a graduate from one of our preacher training schools. He just wanted to preach. He came pretty cheap, so they hired him. I mean, he just wanted to preach. He had a great love for kids. And they have a lot of low-income housing projects around there with a lot of kids. So he started going to these projects and bringing these kids in. They went from 10 to where they average now about 60 to 70 people every Sunday. And they had a VBS, and they had 85 people every night at this VBS. So the preacher called me up one time and he said, I'm having a little difficulty here because the bulk of their attendance is kids. And he said, they just don't want to sit still. They're unchurched. They don't want to sit still during the sermon. I said, then stop preaching for 30 minutes. I said, have you ever thought about just doing VBS every Sunday? And he was like, can we do that? Well, if you can do it once a year, brother, you can do it every Sunday. I mean, do it every Sunday. Have a puppet show. Just preach for a couple of minutes and then have some songs that those kids know and that they like. Get them engaged. If your goal is to teach them to love Jesus, then don't try to do it teaching the 70-year-olds in the group. Because those kids don't understand repentance and the watery grave of baptism. And bring us back at the next appointed time. They don't understand that kind of stuff. They just want to know about Jesus. Imagine if we restructured the way that we deliver the message. The message didn't change for him, but how he's delivering it is changing. And if we can do that, it'll be interesting to see how things would change for the church. Instead of assuming the worst, let's think the best. Let's think positive. We need to be positive that change can be good if we will do it. He also said that knowledge gaps are filled with fear instead of faith. And this is a big one for me. Because this is why change brings about such resistance and conflict. Because the way that we tend to implement change is this. We get in the pulpit one Sunday and we say, next week we're going to start doing this. Or we're going to stop doing this. And people in the group are like, what? Who made that decision? Why did they make that decision? When do they think that's going to take place? Who's going to help them do that? I mean, they start asking all these questions. And that fear creeps in because there are knowledge gaps. Now, I'm going to tell you several times today that if you're going to implement change, the worst place that you can implement it is telling it from the pulpit. Our delivery system cannot be the pulpit, nor email, nor text, nor a flyer, nor the bulletin. Those delivery systems don't work. You want me to tell you how I know? When do y'all do announcements? Before or after? Before service. How many people are listening before service when you got kids? Not very many. In fact, most people who don't have kids aren't listening either. And the thing is, we continue to do that. We continue to make those announcements, and I'm not saying announcements are unimportant. I'm just trying to say that we continue to do that, and people aren't listening. I've heard people say, when did they decide to do this? They said, well, they've been announcing it for the last 3 months. Wasn't listening. If you're going to make change, you're going to have to sit down and talk to people face to face. Because they are going to have questions. And you need to give them an opportunity to ask them. Don't have an open forum. That's not going to work. Sit down and talk to people face to face. Give that individual, that family, an opportunity to ask questions. Because if you will do that, it will satisfy this knowledge gap. You're going to explain to them why you made the decision, how you came to the conclusions that you did, when this is going to take place, who's going to be involved, and you're going to ask them for their support to help bring it about. Now, you do that face-to-face with someone, they're going to feel satisfied that you have communicated to them. So when you then announce it from the pulpit after everybody in the congregation has been informed, they're not going to go, oh. They're going to say, cool, I already know what's going on. And they're going to love that. They're going to feel informed. And people who are informed are going to be excited. Number 3, emotions influence receptivity. We are, for all the lack of our efforts to remove emotions from our worship assemblies, we are emotional people. God made us emotional people. God is emotional. I mean, He has anger. He has joy. I mean, God is a jealous God. I mean, He has emotions. We are emotional creatures. But somehow we're devoid of it once we go into this auditorium. I tell you, I've been to I don't know how many worship services in my lifetime. Most of them are more like a funeral. I've sat on the stage and watched people when they're singing songs, and you would never know they had joy in their heart because there's no smile on their face. Now, if you go to visit someone, and it's just this downer, are you going to go back? People in the community aren't either. Now, I'm not saying that we need to have a band. I think you already understand that by now. And I'm not saying we need to jump up and roll down the aisles. My dad, growing up, used to go watch Pentecostal church because he thought it was so funny that they would roll down the aisles. I'm not saying we need to do that. But we should at least be excited. We should at least be happy. We should be thrilled that we're getting to sing songs of praise to our God. We should be thankful for what He's done for us that makes it possible for us to even be Christians. But when we get in there and we have a frown or a scowl look on our face and our arms crossed like we're mad, I ain't coming back. If I'm a visitor, I'm like, whoo, I want no part of that. We're going to reach people. We're going to have to understand that our emotions influence our receptivity. And when people are angry, emotionally distraught over a change, they're not going to be very receptive of it. And a part of that goes back to the whole communication piece. And then this idea that they can only handle so much change at one time is one of the reasons why it's so difficult. And isn't that the truth? I mean, I have a friend of mine, he says, Bob, sometimes you just have to blow it up and start over. I'm like, that may be true in some situations, but I don't think that's what we need to do with the church. I don't think we need to blow it up and start over. Although I've been to some places that probably would have been a good thing. But the point I'm trying to make here is that you can't go in and just say we're going to do all these massive changes because people aren't going to like that. It is incremental. Just don't make it so small in the increments that people don't even know that change is taking place. Communicating the change and why we're making the change and all those things that I talked about will make the difference. And then this last piece, it's generally seen as a threat, which is why people are so resistant to it. When people feel threatened by a change, they're going to be resistant. And so we just have to make sure we understand that church change is difficult. And so we've got to figure out how we do that. I want to share with you some material real quickly.
Seen as a threat.
Yeah, sorry I didn't leave that up there long enough. Seen as a threat, which is why they're resistant. Are you familiar with Stephen Covey?
Yeah.
7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Stephen Covey, in his book, talked about two circles, if you will. One he calls the circle of influence, and the other is the circle of concern. Now, there are two different ways of looking at this, and I'll explain how he talks about it. Then I'm going to introduce a third circle of my own that I think is the one that we need when it comes to the church, and certainly as we think about navigating the church in today's culture. Covey pointed out that when our circle of concern becomes so great and our primary focus, then our circle of influence shrinks. Now, the circle of concern involves those areas that I have absolutely no control over. I have no control over the economy of the United States. I have no control over the weather. I have no control over the war in Ukraine. I have no control over so many things in my life, that are surrounding us in our world. I have no control over those things. I have a brother, 8 years older than me, and he spends most of his day watching CNN. And I'm like, listen, get a life. If all you're doing is watching the news is only going to give you the negative things. I mean, what was that little song by Lynn Anderson? I'm sure could use a little good news today. I mean, we look at our world as just so negative. We're so bombarded by all of that stuff. And it's like it affects us mentally and emotionally. And we need to be careful about that kind of stuff. I mean, fill our hearts and our minds with those things that are pure and good and honest and good report and excellence and so on. I mean, that's the stuff we need to focus on. But what happens when we spend all of our time here focusing on those things we have no control over, then the circle of influence shrinks. Now, on the opposite side here, when we spend our time focusing on the things that we can control, both directly and indirectly, then we shrink that circle of concern. Now, when I say the things that we can control directly and indirectly, I can control what I eat. I can control whether I exercise. I can control certain things in my life. I control the decisions that I make. Where I'm going to go, what I'm going to do, those kinds of things. Now, indirectly, I have some control when it comes to things like my kids, my grandkids. Now, my kids are old enough now, they're making their own decisions. But there are times they'll call me and they'll ask about certain decisions. I have some indirect control there. I can influence them by giving them pros and cons or asking them questions to help them come to the right decision. So I have some indirect influence when it comes to the way they raise their kids. My favorite thing is when my daughter says, "Did I really act like that?" I'm like, "Oh yeah. You acted just like that. And now you're paying for your raising." And so it's one of those things that I have some indirect control there when I look at her and I say, "Look, here's the way we handle that situation." So it at least gives her some options to think about how she's going to deal with her situation. And so we have some things that we can indirectly control and some things that we directly control. If we will focus on those, then it's amazing how we become so less concerned about those other areas that we have absolutely no control over. Now, for me, there's a third circle here. Oh, let me say this. If you look at the circle on the left, that's being proactive, and the circle on the right is being reactive. If we're only focused on those things that we can't control, we become reactive to what we're hearing and seeing. But if we focus on the things that we can control directly or indirectly, we are more proactive because we're trying to take control of those things in our life that we do have some influence over. Now, this third circle, I call the circle of trust. Those first two circles are important. But it's this third circle that is vital when it comes to the direction of leadership. Because people will not follow leaders they do not trust. It is the most precious commodity that you have. Trust. Several years ago, this will tell you how long this was, Houston Nutt was the head football coach at the Arkansas Razorback football program. That was a long time ago. But he spoke at a Chamber of Commerce banquet one night. And I was writing down some notes because I was sitting at the head table up there. And I led prayer at the banquet, so I'm sitting up there. I'm taking down some notes as he's speaking. And he talked about how that every incoming freshman into the Razorback football program they sat down with, and they wanted to emphasize to them what a great privilege it was to be an Arkansas Razorback. And he said, and then we asked them three questions. One, can I trust you? Can I trust you to go to class? Can I trust you to do the work, your assignments, those kinds of things? Number two, are you committed? Are you committed to being an Arkansas Razorback? Are you committed to giving 100% of your effort on the field, off the field, so on? When he asked the third question, I'm not sure what he said after that, because I was thinking spiritual the whole time. He said, the third question is, do you care? In that moment, I thought, if you take a group of people that you can trust, who are committed to the cause, and who care, you can change the world. It's the only thing that ever has. But it's that first question that intrigues me the most, especially from a spiritual standpoint. Can I trust you? All of my life, I've heard sermons about putting our full and complete trust in God. I get that. I know the verse. In fact, I'll never forget the first time I read it. I was getting ready to preach the first time I'd ever preached for a congregation the size that I was where my dad was at. I hadn't even started school yet. And so he wanted me to preach one Sunday night to get some experience. I'm sitting on the front row, must have been a little bit fidgety. And he looked over and he said, "Son, are you nervous?" All I could get out was, "Yep." I mean, I was scared to death. I didn't know what else to say. And he opened his Bible up to Proverbs 3. And he said, read verses 5 and 6. And you know it. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean upon your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge God, and He will make your path straight. And I thought, that's great, but I'm still nervous. And so, trust. But it's led me to think from the standpoint of, I get it, that we need to put our complete and total trust in God, but I don't think that's the question we need to be asking. I think the question that we need to ask is, can God trust us? I mean, we're told in 1 Corinthians chapter 4 that we're stewards of the mysteries of God, and it is required of stewards that they be found trustworthy. Are we worthy of God's trust and all that He's entrusted to us? I pray that every morning, that I would live my life in a way that is worthy of all that God has entrusted to me. Can He trust me to be a good student of His Word? Can He trust me to reach out to those who are outside of Christ and bring them in? Can He trust me to love His church? Can He trust me to lead and to make the right choices? I mean, there's so many different questions. But can He trust us? This circle of trust is so vital. And there are a number of components that are a part of it. Number one has to do with competence. People will trust you when you are competent. And the way that we develop competence and credibility is by making good decisions in our life. Wise decisions. Not making knee-jerk reactions, but instead proactively seeking the wisdom and the counsel of others so that we make the right decisions. When we demonstrate that type of competence, then people will learn to trust us. The second part of this involves integrity. And I have a lesson that I do from Psalm 15 on integrity. You know, who is it that can walk into God's presence and stay in His presence? But the one who walks with integrity. How do you define integrity? I've asked that question to so many different groups over the years, and the answer I commonly get is this idea that it's doing the right things when no one else is watching, even if it costs you something. Isn't that interesting? If we just practice that definition alone, I mean, how significant would that be? Doing the right things. I always tell people that integrity to me is practicing the presence of God. Because if there are things that I will do when no one else is watching that I would not do or say or go or participate in if an elder or the preacher were there, then I'm giving more credibility and respect to a man than I am to God, because God sees it all. And so we need to practice God's presence. That will help increase our integrity. And then transparency. I talked a little bit about this last night. I'm going to talk more about it in just a second. But transparency is so important. We in the church are not good at that. We're not good at being transparent. We don't want people to know we have problems. You know, I mentioned that movie, What About Bob? I love Bob in that movie because he's like, I've got problems. I mean, and he wasn't afraid to share them. He was very transparent about his problems. And we all have problems, but we just don't like to share them. We don't want people to know it. And maybe from a humility standpoint, we don't want to burden other people with them. But let me tell you, that's what the church is about. We're about a family. I know when my wife has problems because she tells me. I know when my kids are struggling and they have problems because they tell me. There's a lot of transparency that takes place there. But somehow when we get to the church, we don't want people to know that we're struggling. It was an alarming thing to me when I found out that 2 to 3 out of every 5 people in the church. Now, I'm not saying this is true in every congregation, so don't misunderstand me. But the statistic is that 2 to 3 people out of every 5 struggle with pornography. Isn't that a frightening thing? I mean, it is the silent sin, secret sin. Because it's like people can hide it. They have it on their phones, they have it on their laptops. Access to it is so easy now. Isn't that a shame? But do we even know who those people are? I mean, do they feel comfortable enough coming to us and saying, I'm struggling with this? The church should be the place of refuge where they have no fear of being able to share because they're not going to be looked upon or looked down upon negatively. The church has to be the place where we can express those things and find help.
Yes.
But a lot of people are afraid to express that because they know that the minute they step out in that aisle, then 100 other people are going to be going, what did they do? And so they're not going to do that. We need to change that. We need to change that type of atmosphere. The fourth piece here is benevolence. When I say benevolence as a leader, I'm not talking about taking care of the homeless or feeding people who are hungry and clothing. That's not the type of benevolence I'm talking about. I'm talking about benevolence from the standpoint of, do people know that as a leader, you are working for their best interest? That you want what's best for them? Because if people don't realize that you're doing what's best for them, then they're going to question your leadership. Because that's what a leader is supposed to do. He works for the good of others and he speaks up for their welfare. We talked about that last night from Esther chapter 10. And so the idea is that leaders are benevolent leaders. They're working for the good of other people. And then there's authenticity. This is one of those buzzwords that we hear a lot in our world today. Being authentic. Well, let me tell you, this is a challenge for us in the church. Because generally speaking, and again, I don't know everybody. I'm just talking about the generic things that I have experienced and I know in the lives of others. But generally speaking, what happens is that we show up and the minute we get out of our car, we put on our Christian coat and we come through the door and we hold out our hands and we say, hey brother, how you doing? And everything is, I'm great. Isn't it a great day to be a Christian? Now I'll tell you, to be just as transparent as I know to be, that when I was younger and my wife and I had our kids, we were fighting on the way to the church, and the minute we got out the door, we put a smile on our faces and acted like we were in heaven. And the minute we got back in the car, we started over. And I mean, that's reality. We didn't want those people to know that we were fighting, arguing with our kids. We didn't want that. We wanted them to see us a certain way. And we do that in the church. We're not authentic. And our world sees us as inauthentic. Because they see us putting on those Christian garments, going in and doing this service like our world is perfect and that we are super holy and that we're the most godly people on the earth. And then they see us on our work jobs, or they see us in our homes or in our communities, fighting, arguing, and doing things that are unethical. And they're like, I want no part of it. Because they don't see it as authentic. We have to change that. And then the last piece is shared belief. Trust comes as a result of a belief that we share. We share this belief in the same things. And certainly that is the case when it comes to our God and His Word. And so these are just 6 of the factors that for me, when we think about this concept of these circles of leadership, yes, we need to focus on our circle of influence. But we need this circle of trust so desperately. We need to know that the people that we lead, that we can trust them, and they need to know they can trust us. And a lot of factors go into that. Now, I mentioned to you before this concept of the 7 tactics for leading in the zones. I talked about the comfort zone, the combat zone, the danger zone, the end zone, and then the 7 tactics. I'm not going to go through all 7 of them because obviously we don't have time to do all that. There are 2 that to me are the most important when it comes to the church, and so I'm going to talk about them. When I did this book, when I wrote this book, I interviewed 5 different military leaders. I interviewed a 2-star general in the Army. I interviewed 2 Navy admirals, a captain in the Navy, and I interviewed a lieutenant colonel in the Army. And a major in the Marines, 6 people. I had a major in the Marines, a nephew of mine who's a major. And so I interviewed all these guys. And I wanted to gather information about how do you prepare for combat, how do you prepare others for combat, dealing with conflict, how do you communicate the mission? How do you know the mission was understood or what you communicated was understood? So I went through all these questions that I was asking in incredible interviews. They were all so gracious and generous to help in this discussion. And so what they shared with me became the basis for these 7 tactics for leading in the zones. Now, how do you lead people out of their comfort zone by implementing change and dealing with the conflict that comes about? And how do you avoid going into the danger zone? And how do you get to the end zone? And how do you prevent the end zone from becoming a new comfort zone? Continuing to proceed towards growth and development. And so these 7 tactics are part of that. The 2 that I want to share with you are, first, recon. Now, don't let that deceive you, because there are 3 parts to this. Reconnaissance is one of the things that the military talks a lot about. And one of the general that I interviewed, he said, any plan, you have to start with reconnaissance. And I thought, okay, that's pretty cool. And so I had 3 different pieces that were going to go in part of this. And my daughter was like, hey, you should call this recon because of reconnaissance. And I was like, she's so smart. And so the book changed to now the first tactic is recon. It's rethinking how we communicate, how we operate, and how we negotiate. Those are the 3 pieces. And so let me start with just talking about communication. Sometimes we have to rethink not just what we communicate, but how we communicate. Now, to me, and I have 2 separate pieces. One is effective communication, and the other is communicating effectively. Let me explain the difference. Effective communication deals with the means that we use to communicate. For example, we have a great tendency to rely upon electronic devices. We text, we email, we send a bulletin, we announce from the pulpit, all those kinds of things that I talked about earlier. Those are means that we use to communicate. But let me just say that if you are going to lead people out of their comfort zone and deal with the resistance that comes from making those changes, then the way that you're going, the means that you use to communicate must be face to face. I cannot emphasize that enough. In fact, let me tell you about a situation that happened in a congregation that I worked with in Virginia. We went through this whole workshop just like we're doing today, and I told them what I'm about to tell you. That once you settle on a vision statement for this congregation, that your next step is to start meeting with every family in this congregation face to face. And you tell them about this process that we've gone through, and you're going to share with them why you've done this, how you came about this vision statement, and why this vision statement is so important, and you're going to ask for their help in reaching it. This congregation I told that to, well, they had about 120 members. They had 4 elders. The elders thought that was going to take too much time, and it was going to be too laborious for them. So they had the preacher preach a sermon on it. And it divided the congregation. And the reason was because there was one family that was not a part of that workshop. They were a founding part of that congregation. And they went to the elders and they were like, why were we not included? They didn't have any input whatsoever as to how they came to the conclusion. They didn't explain why. They didn't explain how. They didn't explain what they were wanting to do. They just made this blanket statement, and the preacher did it from the pulpit in a sermon, and they got mad. And they had divided that congregation. And they started another church less than a mile away. Now, I'm not advocating what they did was right. But what the elders did wasn't right either. Because I told them, you can't do that. Now, maybe God let that happen so I'd have an illustration. I don't know, but the point is, if you're going to get 100% buy-in from this congregation on your vision, you're going to have to talk to them face to face and give them an opportunity to ask questions that you can answer face to face. Now, that's going to take time. And it's going to take a lot of energy and effort. But that's the only way to get buy-in. You've got to talk to people face to face. Don't send it in an email. Don't send it in a text. Don't send a flyer in the mail. Don't announce it from the pulpit. Don't do a sermon on it until after everybody knows. Now, after everybody knows, then do a series of sermons on it. That's a whole different ballgame. But you got to talk to people face to face. Now, there are a lot of folks in this congregation. In this meeting. So it's not just the elders that can do that. All of you can do that. And you got to sit down and figure out and strategically design who's going to see who. And we're going to sit down and talk to everybody and answer questions and try to get everybody on board with what the direction is. You got to rethink how you communicate, not just what you communicate. So the means is the first piece of that. Now, communicating effectively deals with the implementation. It's more the method, if you will. And this is about understanding. To me, there's a difference in being able to communicate. A lot of people can communicate in the same language. Here's the challenge. There are 6 messages that take place every time you speak. 1, there's what you think you say. And then there's what you think, or then what you actually say. So what you think you say, and then what you actually say. Then there's what the other person hears you say. And then there's what they think they heard you say. And then there's what they say they think they heard you say. And then there's what you hear them say about what they think they heard you say in the first place. Let me tell you what, even when you're speaking English, that's a complicated thing. Then you got body language and tone of voice. I mean, you got all of these nuances to try and get people to understand. So here's what I do. To me, communicating effectively, in order to reach understanding, you've got to give people an opportunity to repeat back to you what they think they heard you say. Because what happens when you do that is you have the opportunity of saying, I didn't say that at all. And they're like, well, that's what I thought I heard you say. Then you can correct it. Because, you know, as much as I like to think that what I think is coming out my mouth, it doesn't always happen that way. Sometimes I say things, but I didn't think that. I was thinking something different. So we have to be very careful about that, and the way that we rectify that understanding is giving people an opportunity to tell us. Let them ask questions. And so understanding is the ultimate goal of communication. And communicating effectively involves understanding. And when you hear people say things, learn to use the terminology, what I'm hearing you say is this. And then repeat it to them. Because they can then say, now, let me tell you, that's happened more than one time in my marriage. I don't know about y'all's, but mine, there have been many times that Cheryl said something. I thought she said something else. She's like, I didn't say that at all. I'm like, well, that's what I heard you say. It's like, well, that's not what I said. Well, then we're going to have some clarification here. And so it has to happen. Now, here's part of the problem for me when it comes to communication, is that if you're like me, when my wife comes into the office, I usually have my laptop open and I'm working. Now, I've learned, it's taken me a few times, but I've learned that when she makes the trek up the stairs to come into my office, that I need to shut the lid on my laptop, turn on my phone. Because it's important to listen to what she has to say. It's taken me twice, but 2 times is all I needed. I can be slow, but it took me 2 times that she would say, we're done. And I was like, no. Now, see, normally I just wait for her to draw a breath because I think she wants me to fix it. And so I'm just going to jump in when she draws a breath and tell her what to do. And that doesn't work. And it took me 2 times and she's like, we're done. And I'm like, no. Finish what you want to say. She goes, no, you're not listening. I said, yes, I am. And you know the death blow, right? Tell me what I just said. Jesus? God? Keep me near the cross. It's one of those things. That's what happens. You guys are laughing because you know that's what happens. Tell me what I just said. And so I took it twice, but now I've learned that I shut the lid on the laptop because if you're like me, the email's usually open and my mind goes ding. I'm like, I want to look and see who sent me an email. And so I have to shut those things off. I have to give her my undivided attention and listen. And then I have to repeat back what I hear her saying. Make sure I understood. Well, we got to do the same thing when it comes to church. So rethink how we communicate. We have to rethink how we operate. Now, this whole operation piece involves, obviously, what we're doing on Sundays, what we do on Wednesday nights, the whole operation of not changing singing a cappella, not changing taking the Lord's Supper, not talking about prayer. We're not talking about those pieces. What we're talking about is, how do we do them? I mean, why do we have 2 songs of prayer? Announcements, 2 songs, prayer, song. Y'all do the Lord's Supper before or after the sermon? Before, so we have the Lord's Supper. We have another song. We announce the invitation song. We have a sermon. We have an invitation. We have a closing song, closing prayer, and then we're done. do that order? It's the way we've always done it. Well, it's so predictable that generally speaking, now I'm not saying everybody because I know not everybody's like me, but it's so predictable and so familiar to us that rarely are we truly engaged. We couldn't tell you the third verse of a 4-verse song because we never sing it, number one. But number 2, we don't pay attention enough to the words because we're more concerned with how it sounds than we are singing our parts, which is one of our downfalls in the church. I wish we'd never come up with 4-part harmony. If you've ever gone overseas and sang with the church in Africa or Cambodia or Haiti or Central America, the singing is so different. Mainly because they put their heart and soul into it. I mean, it's so loud you can't even hear yourself sing. But we've got to rethink how we operate. And we're going to have to not change the pieces, but we may need to change the structure in which the pieces are done. What if we spent more time one week on prayer? Could we do that? Would it still be worship if we only sang one song and we spent more time in prayer?
Yes.
What about we had a week where we spent the entire service focused all of the songs on, and we focused a short message on the Lord's Supper?
Mm-hmm.
What if we had a week to where we really focused just on kids' songs? You know, we're going to sing every one of those VBS songs. Booster, booster. Be a booster. Don't be a rooster. What if we focused one week just on our kids? We got those kids all rallied up front, and we just had a message that was for those kids. You see, I'm not saying we have to do the same thing every week because that then becomes the new tradition. But what I am saying is can we not change it up? We need to rethink how we operate. We may even need to rethink the time in which we operate. I mean, why 9 and 10? Now, maybe that's what works best here. I'm not saying to change that. For us in Canada, we met at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, let me tell you why that was so cool. Because when I met people in the community and I invited them to come, they said, oh, no, we've got our own church we go to. I said, yeah, but y'all meet at 10. We meet at 3. So now you have no excuse. And we really did reach a few folks that way. Because they would come and they'd check us out at 3 o'clock in the afternoon because they didn't meet at 3. So we weren't trying to get them to abandon theirs. We just wanted them to come see something different. And we met at 3. And so, I don't know. I mean, again, you have to ask those questions of who are you trying to reach? What are you trying to accomplish? And can we make some changes in a way that's going to help us do that? Rethink. We just got to back up and think outside the box and listen to younger voices. Now, I know that's hard to do as an older person. Because I'm telling you, it's hard for me to hear some of the conversations I'm hearing my kids talk about. But I'm trying to be open to listen to, okay, is it unscriptural or does it just make me uncomfortable? Because if it just makes me uncomfortable, there's a good chance I've been in the comfort zone a little too long. And so we've got to be able to determine those things and be able to listen to those younger voices and make the changes that need to be made so that we can be more effective. And that's what this is all about. The negotiation piece, if you've never read the book by Chris Voss called, I knew I'd forget it. I'll think of it in a minute. Chris Voss is a retired FBI negotiator. And he wrote this book called Never Split the Difference. It's negotiating as if your life depends on it. And you know, sometimes we have this mindset that when it comes to change, we have to compromise. And compromise is not what I'm talking about here. Compromise is not good. What I am talking about is how do we come to an agreement? How do we negotiate the types of things that we're wanting to change in a way that we can all agree and get to yes? Well, read the book. There's a lot of information in there about how we do that. But negotiating is very important. And again, we're not compromising. We're just trying to come to an agreement so that we can be on the same page, moving in the same direction. Now, the other piece I want to talk about just real quickly is this one, mission training. So we have to rethink how we communicate, how we operate, how we negotiate. But then there's this piece about mission training. And I have hyphenated these two words for a reason. The first part is mission. Do people know the mission? You know, sometimes we think people know the mission, and they really don't know the mission. And they don't know why this mission. So we're going to have to find a way to communicate the mission. But here's the biggest piece. And it's training them for the mission. Now, is it true here, like it is in every congregation I've ever been to, that you have trouble getting Bible class teachers?
Yes.
I mean, it's like, shoot me now. I mean, nobody wants to teach Bible class. We can't get people who want to teach Bible class. Well, here's the problem. Are you retired? Are you retired?
No, sir.
What do you do for a living?
Transport refrigeration.
Okay. Transport refrigeration, what do you do?
Curriculum writing in Spanish.
Ah, curriculum writing in Spanish. I would have never taken you for that. That's cool. I have to introduce you to my son. What do you do?
Our auto dealership.
Oh, we need to talk. No. Yeah, we can burger, we can on the score.
Work for the Social Security Administration.
Okay.
Retired.
What did you do before?
I work for AT&T.
AT&T, okay. I know you're a preacher.
Counselor.
Counselor? Okay.
Nonprofit.
Okay.
Retired.
What
Retired.
did you do before?
Worked in a steel mill.
Steel mill?
School state attorney.
Okay.
Financial aid in college.
Retired.
Retired?
Retired.
What did you do before?
Work for, there's a utility company,
Okay. Military?
Retired. Worked for the Department of Veterans Affairs.
Veterans Affairs, okay.
Mechanic.
Mechanic, okay.
Retired. Education.
Education?
Retired.
Military?
Mama, homeschool teacher.
Love you. It's the hardest job I know.
Same on homeschool.
Okay.
Retired. Worked for Blue Cross and Blue Shield.
Okay.
Retired. Worked retail.
Retail?
School secretary.
Okay.
Retired. Still cook.
Cook? Okay.
A teacher and a coach.
Love you. We're going to talk more later.
At risk coordinator for teens.
Okay.
Retired. Day patrol.
Okay. So out of this room, 2 people that have any kind of training in teaching. See, that's our problem. In the church, we ask people who have all these other skills. They're trained in all these other areas, and we're saying, would you teach a Bible class? And they're like, no! I mean, first of all, it's 45 minutes long.
Yes.
Let me do the sermon. At least it's only 30. And so it's like, we just get this mindset of thinking people ought to just volunteer and be lined up to volunteer to teach a class. And I'm like, it's not going to happen. But what if we train them? I mean, would you be willing, if someone came along, if the church said, look, we're going to provide you with the training over the next 6 months or a year to learn how to teach a class, would you be willing to do that training on Sunday morning during the Bible class hour? Not going to have you come at a separate time. It's not going to be a weekend workshop. It's going to be on Sunday morning when you're already here. We're going to have a class where you're going to learn how to teach. Would you be willing to take that class over the next 6 months to a year? Train them for the mission. But see, what we do is we ask people to take on the responsibility of doing something. Of course, y'all are teachers too. I know you're teaching kids. The thing is, we ask people to take on this job of doing something they're not equipped to do. And that's the part we're going to have to change. We're going to have to equip them. That's what it's all about, is equipping people for the work of service. And we're going to have to not ask for volunteers. We're going to have to ask people if they'd be willing to take a class and learn how to do this. Because we might be surprised it's not as complicated as you think it is. But if you're thinking you're going to have to get up and lecture for 45 minutes, then yes. You know the number one fear, right? Is public speaking. People would rather face death as they had speak publicly. Some of us are just morons and we don't know any better, so we'll get up and we'll speak anyway. But the thing is, we've got to equip people to do it. And if we will train them for the mission, they're going to be more likely to carry out the mission. So I've gone way too long. You've listened so graciously, and I appreciate it. We're going to take a break, okay? So let's take a short break, about 10 minutes, and then the last piece of this before lunch is going to be a lot of work you guys are going to do. You're going to be working on some pieces that are going to, especially right after the break, you're going to be working on the pieces that are going to be foundational for your vision statement. Because I've given you enough information now to kind of see the overall picture that we're facing in the church overall, from the leadership all the way down to the implementation of change and how to deal with the resistance that change that comes and how we do that. And now let's get this vision piece in place, because once the vision is there, change is coming. You cannot remain still and do the same thing with a vision, or you'll never achieve it. So we're going to talk about that. Come back after prayer. Yeah. It's all about. They're going to be introduced to the Lord's Word. And so they come every Sunday morning. And we have things there. And the long-term goal is, a couple of years, we're going to have 4 or 5 maybe more that are.
Yeah, he said, here's the benefit, you don't work for something that you've done something, whatever.
So Mark is his favorite. So long the word is short, it's and once
Well, I just, he was saying, he just
first time second time
maybe
you work it out every 2 years. Now he may have a we're not going to burn him out teaching. Okay, so let's figure out here how we're going to try to do this. If if you three ladies, if you don't mind moving back just a couple of seats there to work with them. What we're going to do in this session to start with is you're going to have to work in your groups at your tables to have some discussion. I don't know how we're going to do that over there with you, Johnny. We'll get those guys maybe move down there closer to you so that you guys can maybe get a piece of paper and you can write some of these things down. But where we're going to start is looking at some congregational dynamics. And what I want you to spend a few moments listening out for me are, if you were going to make a list of your 3 greatest needs as a church, what would you consider to be your 3 greatest needs? Now, I will suggest that you list out more than 3 because the way we'll do this is everybody's going to share. And I'll start with 1 here, then 1 here. And generally, if you only have 3, and by the time I get around to this table and I've covered 5 others, their needs may all be taken up. So, but list out what you consider at least to be your 3 greatest needs as the church here at Ovilla. And anywhere you want to write it down, you can use that sheet of paper on the table and make a list there, or if you've got a tablet you want to write on, that's fine too. But just start writing those things down. I'm going to kind of walk around and see if I can help in any way. But then I'm going to list these things out on this tablet up here. These are going to be foundational for the development of your vision. A vision is birthed out of your needs. And I'll explain more about that as we go along. But we're going to start right there. So go ahead, if you would, write out what you consider to be your 3 greatest needs, and or 4 or 5 or 6, whatever you want. And we'll take about 4 or 5 minutes, and then we're going to share.
The church.
Yeah, the church here at Ovilla.
Okay, brother, start talking. Let's list some conversations in the next one. Yeah.
Because I was scared.
Doesn't matter. So that's another minute, then we're gonna share. Okay, so y'all ready to share?
Yes, sir.
Okay, y'all went to town on this pretty quick. All right, let's start right here. Give me one.
Unity,
Unity. Okay.
spiritual,
Spiritual unity, is that what you said?
spiritual unity,
Spiritual unity, okay. Give me another one.
growth by reaching.
Not you guys, not you guys. Let's stay over back here. Don't get hit every gun. We're going to come back around, so hold that thought.
We said one of ours was openness or open-mindedness.
Oh, okay, very good. Very good. Who wants to be?
We said, community outreach and connection.
All right.
Outreach connection.
You said connection?
Yes.
Okay. Ladies?
Well, our first one was we need a youth minister.
A youth minister, okay?
Yes. We're working
We talked about relationships, like in our church community, building deeper relationships and community with each other and connections.
Okay. Building deeper relationships. I'm going to put internally here. Because we kind of have this piece here. And ladies, give me another one.
Our number one was communication.
Communication. I think I heard that somewhere. It's the number one. If I were going to give a need that almost every congregation gives me, communication would be the number one most common need in congregations. Give me number two here.
More fasting and prayer.
Fasting and prayer, okay? Got another one?
Training.
Trainings, okay? Any specific or just overall?
Say overall.
Okay. That's one of my favorite sounds. Rip. So I'm going to put these up over here where y'all can take a picture of them and see them a bit later. Because you will need these when it comes to developing the vision. I'll explain that in just a moment. All right.
You said, putting God first or getting close to Him.
Okay.
Which one do we want to do? We put like ministries in the park, et cetera, and so it's kind of under the community again, going out into the more ministry out.
Okay.
I'll just say as you can articulate how you want to write that down right there. But it was helping everyone in the congregation to find their fit and how they can be involved to serve.
Can I phrase it? Find your giftedness?
Do it.
Okay.
Can I add to that? Because we kind of talked about, like, and it kind of ties in, it's like inner and outer engagement. And kind of getting past that mindset of, you know, like what she was saying, moving from we come to church to sit and occupy space versus coming to church to serve God and use our gifts to serve Him, and then also doing that kind of outside of our walls as well.
Okay. So not just finding your giftedness, but using it. Okay? Very good. And we can expound on that more, but for now. Give me that. Follow through, okay? Very good. Got another one over here, guys?
Training.
We already have that one.
Okay. More worship, implying thankfulness, a more grateful heart.
Okay?
That's all our list.
Okay?
I'll add leadership. We need leadership.
All right.
I thought we might need, we used to have 200 here. We need to get people back that's not here now. That's
Hold
a
that
need.
thought.
That's a need.
Hold that thought. We're only down one per table. Getting people back. Okay. You guys got another one back there?
You said, I almost want to say it, but kind of a rotation or succession of leadership, like ongoing influence leadership.
I'm just going to put that out here beside leadership succession because that's exactly right. Yeah, plan for developing others to be leaders. Yeah. Very good. You got another one?
You said openness, being open to all, all subjects.
That's
All.
open-minded.
Okay.
Yeah, we got open-mindedness. You got anything else?
Well, we talked about just with ladies, having more lady things with the ladies.
All right.
Our last one we put down, children's. We focused on our children, developing them.
Y'all ready? Isn't that nice? All right. We're doing some good things here. Where do we get to here?
So we put down having a class or support for new converts.
Okay. You got anything else, guys, we don't have?
Well, probably think that it's been said in so many words, but professional development for Christians we should have something, and that goes underneath the training portion, but
But you're thinking more from the standpoint of training people in professional fields?
well, exactly, because you're gonna need that in order to train the younger kids, or what like we said earlier in class. We have to have a professional development in Christianity to be able to teach the younger youth. And so we come together to do that, and then after we do that, then we can go out and maybe teach Bible class and teach other stuff.
Well, how cool would it be for people in this community to find out that if they wanted to learn how to develop in a specific area, they could come here?
Exactly.
I think that'd be cool. Yeah, very good. Guys, you got another one we don't have?
Inclusion and transparency.
Inclusion, transparency.
What do y'all mean by inclusion?
Like, just these things like involvement, like, having areas and finding ways to get more people, I guess it goes along with involvement and finding your different, inclusion.
Getting everybody involved.
Yes.
Yeah, including everybody at some level. And I think that may tie into, which I think it's good to put it this way, but the idea of giftedness and using your gifts, but it's including everybody in that and making sure everybody, we talked last night about the idea of diversity, inclusion, and belonging. It's not just giving everybody a seat at the table and letting everybody have a voice at the table, but it's listening to every voice at the table. And that's going to be a big thing. I'm sorry.
Question. Can you explain further on that? I was wondering about that last night. Everybody having a seat at the table and having a voice. Do you mean literally everybody, or are you talking about leadership, or?
I'm talking about everybody. Even down to your teenagers. Are we listening to the teenagers? Because I think a lot of times teenagers feel like they're not heard. It's like, okay, they're sitting at the table, but we don't really listen to them because they're young. You don't know, you haven't had life experience, you don't understand how decisions are made, that kind of thing. But are we listening to them? As their voice heard? I'm going to share a vision statement with you later that came from a group of teenagers. And they wanted to be a Christ-centered community where everyone was heard, loved, and valued. And I thought, wow, that's probably the most challenging vision statement I've ever seen. Is they want everybody to be loved, valued, and heard. And for teenagers, that meant more to me because that was telling me they don't feel like they're heard. And so when I say inclusion from that standpoint, I'm thinking everybody, every age group should have a voice. Now, I realize you're not going to take 5-year-olds and give them a voice. But teenagers need to have a voice, and they need to be heard because they're the future. I mean, we keep saying they're the church now, but they're really not because they don't feel like they're heard. Do they have any input that we would say, okay, maybe we need to listen to what they're having to say? Because they're the ones who are going to be inviting their friends, and they're not going to invite their friends into a situation where they feel like they're not going to be valued or heard. And so we need to listen to all. So, where do we get to here?
We had one that was more, I guess we had meals, but it's not just, it was more like a visitation to shut-ins and things like that to visit more.
So a visitation type program. Okay.
We have one, but it's not really.
Needs to be revamped. All right, ladies, you have any more? Here? Any more here? All right. Got everything covered? You guys have anything we don't have? Anybody have anything that we don't have on the lists?
I would add mentoring.
Mentoring, okay. I like that too. Y'all ready? One more time. How I got those straight on that door, I'll never know. Okay, let me explain a little bit about this needs section. Now, the question that I usually follow up with what are your 3 greatest needs is this one. Why do these needs exist? Spiritual unity, open-mindedness. The fact that there's a need to be open-minded says that there are a lot of closed-mindedness here. And so if that's a need, then you got to figure out, okay, why does that need exist? Is there something we need to change? Community outreach, that's pretty common with most congregations, being connected to the community more. What does that connection look like? How do we do that? Youth minister could be an answer to part of that, at least from the young people's perspective. Building deeper relationships from an internal perspective. Communication. I mean, why is that need exist? Just a thought. More fasting and prayer. Boy, you're stepping on some toes, brother. Prayer is not a problem. Fasting comes on, you're stepping on my toes now. More fasting and prayer, training. There are several of these. Now, here's what I want you to be thinking about as we look at these needs. Are there threads that you see? The threads, when you start noticing that there are pieces of your needs that go together. Training, finding your giftedness, leadership succession, mentoring, class, and sport for new Christians, professional, vocational training. Several of those pieces go together. Does that make sense? Yes. And so what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to take a picture of these, because this afternoon we're going to come back to looking at these, and you're going to need to find those threads that exist, because those become pieces of your vision. When I have done vision statement workshops in the past, a lot of times congregations tend to want to describe who they are now. And so I started doing this piece, because if these needs exist, that's not who you are now. These are things in the future that you want to exist. You want to take care of, whether it's the leadership or the training or the unity, whatever that is. Those are things that do not exist now, but you want them to exist. And so your vision is always about the future. And it's going to describe who you want to be that you're not now. And so those become a very key part of that. And then, for those who are resistant to change, can you meet those needs without making changes? See, you can't. There's no way. And again, we haven't mentioned anything about changing doctrine, teaching, none of that stuff. We're not talking about changing God's Word. But there are things that we're going to have to change in order to meet these needs. So we'll talk about what those look like as we move further. So let me talk for just a few moments about the power of vision. I often get this question, why should the church have a vision? Vision's not biblical, it's corporate. I get all of these things. And let me just tell you, I'm thankful that God had vision. Had God not had a vision, His Son would not have come at the perfect time. Had Jesus not had a vision, you talk about wanting unity. Read John 17. You can't read John 17 and not see the vision that Jesus had for the church. His vision was that we would be one, that we would be united. When you look at the prayers of the Apostle Paul in the letters that he wrote to these churches, you see the vision that he had for the church, who he wanted them to be. And so vision is very biblical. And so when I think about the idea of needs and I think about the power of vision, there are a couple of thoughts I've collected over the years that I want to share with you. The first is by P.K. Bernard. P.K. Bernard made the statement that a man without a vision is a man without a future. And a man without a future will always return to his past. I find that an interesting statement. And so what I've done is I've gone back now and I've taken out the word man. And I've inserted the word church. A church without a vision is a church without a future. And a church without a future will always return to its past. Now, Chris Valentin, I follow that up with a statement by him where he said that if our memories are greater than our dreams, we're already dying. Now, when you think about those two statements back to back, and the thought, almost all of my life, I've heard people talk about the church the way it was in the 1950s, 1960s, and so on. And I hear statements like, we were the fastest growing religious organization in this country. That may or may not be true. I don't know. I couldn't statistically prove it one way or the other. But what I do know is this is not 1950. We're not living in the 1960s, and as much as we might have loved that period of time, we can't go back. We're not allowed to go back in time. We're living in the 21st century. This is 2022, and we're quickly approaching 2023. To be honest, when I was in high school, I never thought I'd ever see 2020. I mean, that just was such a foreign concept to think, 2020, do you know how old I'll be in 2020? I mean, I'm thinking I'm never going to see it. But here we are, we're approaching 2023. And our world is not the same today. And if our memories, if all we're going to do is think about how the church used to be and not stop for a moment and think about the great opportunities and the possibilities of what the church can be in the future with God's help, then we're just waiting for our funeral. Because we're dying. We have got to look to the future with greater hope, greater expectation, and greater promise because of who our God is.
Amen. Amen.
That's going to take vision. And what that vision looks like will be up to you. I watched a video clip one time on YouTube, and it was during the pandemic, and I found this guy who was talking about vision. I don't even know who he was. I couldn't even find him to go back and give him credit for it. And then somebody said, well, that's a statement made by Andy Stanley in one of his books. It may be, I don't know. But I just thought it was an interesting statement. You do not have permission to lead or live a visionless life. Now, here's part of the problem. When I wrote this book that you guys have around the table here, Essential, and I gave a copy of that to Dan Winkler. And I wanted Dan to kind of critique it and give me some feedback as to how I might make some changes. And he came up to me after we had a chance to meet, and he said, have you thought about doing this for individuals, not just churches? And I thought, no, but it made me think of something that I hadn't considered. One of the reasons that most churches do not have a vision is because most of us as individuals do not have a vision. We don't think about who we want our life to be in 15 years. We're living so pragmatically. I mean, it's like only what's right here. I don't know, this past couple of days, it seems like I've been doing marriage counseling for some reason. But two couples that I have dealt with over the last couple of days, that both of them are struggling in their marriages. And the problem is both of them, or at least one of the parties in both of those situations, that the partner can't seem to think beyond the decision of right now, just get a divorce. I'll be happy if I can just get rid of this spouse. I'm thinking, they have kids. They have no clue about how this is going to impact those children. And the long-term effects of it. There's no infidelity in either relationship. It's just that they don't like the other person. One of them has been married for 26 years. I was talking to my kids. I just want to turn them over my knee and spank them. Yeah. And the thicker the belt, maybe the better. I don't know. But the thing is, what on earth? This is not about you being happy. This is about you being holy. Amen. This is about being who God wants you to be and making God happy. If you will do that, you'll figure out how to make this work. But see, people can't think long term. They don't have a vision. And because we tend to not have a vision on a personal level, even for within our families, it's hard for us to think of what will the church look like. So I added this question. Do we have permission to lead a visionless church? And the answer is no. We do not. God had a vision. Jesus had a vision. The apostles had a vision for the church. And we need to have one. And that vision is going to be based upon those needs. That's the vision that you see that the Apostle Paul wrote about to each of those congregations was all very explicitly detailed to the needs of that congregation. And when you read the letter, you see the things that he addressed because those were the problems that he's talking about they needed to correct. And so in his prayer, he indicates the vision for that congregation. And so we have to consider that as well. The book of Nehemiah is one of the greatest books when it comes to this idea of vision that I'm aware of. But let me just ask you, what do you think Nehemiah's vision was?
Rebuild the wall.
Rebuild the wall. And I get that all the time. I mean, that's the go-to answer. And I always ask this question. It's a loaded question because it helps me to explain the difference between the concept of vision, mission, and strategic planning.
I just want to see Israel restored.
Did you read my book? No? Part of it. Do you read that section? No. But see, and that's really it. You see, his vision was not about rebuilding the wall. The vision was about restoring Israel to the nation that God wanted them to be. That's who God wanted them to be. It was really God's vision, and Nehemiah shared that vision. But the only way that could be accomplished was carrying out the mission, which was rebuilding the wall. Now, in Nehemiah chapter 2, in verses 17 and 18, we have this text that points out so beautifully for us how that Nehemiah gathered the leaders together, and he says, you see the situation that exists. The walls have been torn down, the gates have been burned. He says, let us arise and build, so that we will no longer be a reproach among the nations. And you have seen how the hand of my God has been favorable to me. In those two verses, there are four statements. Four ideas that are really critical to the idea of vision. One is he defined the problem. He wanted them to see the need that existed. The walls have been torn down and the gates have been burned. When you look over here, that's your wall. That's the wall that has been torn down. That's the gates that have been burned. Those are your needs. But the second part of this is the fact that he offered a solution. We've got to arise and build. We can't stay here. We can't continue to do the same things, which is nothing. We've got to arise and build. And your building is going to involve addressing those needs and doing what has to be done in order to remove them. But then what he did was he told them why. The why behind rebuilding the wall and achieving this vision was so that they would no longer be a reproach. When you look in chapter 1, when those few men first came to Nehemiah from Jerusalem, they reported to him not just that the walls had been torn down and that the gates had been burned, but he said, the people are in reproach. That was why Nehemiah went back. That's why Nehemiah had the vision. It's why Nehemiah had the mission. Because he wanted the people of Israel to no longer be a reproach among the nation. And then, perhaps most importantly, he gave them hope. He said, you have seen how the hand of my God has been favorable to me. That was hope. Because of the very next thing that's said in verse 18 is that the people then all in one voice said, let us arise and build. I'm convinced that if we will explain to people the problem, if we will offer the solution, if we'll tell them why and give them hope, they will respond the same way. But see, we don't do that. Or at least we haven't in the past. We may explain the need or the problem that exists, but we really don't offer a solution. Or we say things like, anybody want to volunteer? I mean, and nobody raises their hand. And so we continue to do the same thing. Nehemiah didn't let that happen. As a leader, Nehemiah gathered them together and he said, you see it? You know the problem exists. Here's the need. Here's what we're going to have to do. Here's why we're going to do it. And let me give you hope because of who our God is. And the people said, let us arise and build. Let me explain the difference between vision, mission, and strategic planning very quickly. When you think about vision, you need to think future. This is who you aspire to be. This is an aspiration that exists. It's not who you are now, but it's who you want to be in the future. The mission involves thinking present. This is actionable. I describe it as a noun and the verb. Your vision is the noun, and the mission is the verb. And so your vision must be descriptive, and your mission must be actionable. And then strategic planning, you need to think details and what these details look like. And so the vision then is who you want to become. So it's going to be a descriptive term. The vision, the mission is going to then be what you have to do in order to achieve that vision. And the strategic planning is how you are going to go about doing that. And let me just say, and I'm not the first to say this, but the who always comes before the what and the how. Because if not, it's like you're driving around without a map and you have no idea where you're going. Why do you do what you do? If there's not a purpose behind it, do not be surprised that people are not buying in and getting involved. But when you can paint that picture of who you want to be and why you're doing these things, because it's going to help you get to that picture, then people are more inclined to buy in and get involved. But if there's no purpose behind it, if there's no reason other than just to continue to perpetuate the same things that we've been doing for the last 75 years, then people are not on board. They're like, I can do that at home. That's the part we got to fix. Okay, so let's talk about the benefits of vision for just a moment. Number one, and first and foremost to me, is it informs decision making. When you have a vision, you have a way to make every decision. Now, I don't know about his congregation, as I've said many times, but the way I've seen it work in the congregations I've been a part of is it doesn't take very long for somebody in the congregation to come in with an idea, and they're going to say, could we do this? And what's the first question that is asked? Not necessarily why. How much does it cost? Because we're concerned about the money that's involved. How much does it cost? Second question is? Say it again.
Who's going to do it?
Who's going to do it? I mean, those are our two questions. Now, there may be others, but those are our two, number one and number two questions. How much it's going to cost is number one, and number two is who's going to do it. Imagine how much different it would be if we started off instead by asking, will this help us achieve our vision? Because if the answer is no, it's not going to help us achieve our vision, then we just tell them no. It may not be no forever, it's just no for now. Because we have these needs and we have this vision that we're trying to achieve. So we want to do those things that are going to help us move toward the vision, not just doing stuff to be doing stuff. So if it helps us achieve the vision, then the answer is yes. And it doesn't matter what it costs. And it doesn't matter who's needed to do it. Because if it helps us achieve the vision and people are bought into the vision, then they'll come up with the money and they will provide the support to do it. Because it's going to move us toward the vision. The second part of this is, and this is perhaps the most important piece, is that when you have a vision, you can go back and look at all of the things you're currently doing and you filter them through the same process. Is what we're doing helping us achieve the vision? If the answer is yes, then we need to not only continue, but maybe we need to figure out how do we beef it up and make it better. But if the answer is no, then it may be time to cut it loose. We're not good at that. We're not good at cutting things loose. We're hoarders. We start a new project and then it becomes a part of our traditional yearly thing and we don't cut it loose even though it's not effective anymore. And the same purpose for which it started no longer exists. We just continue to do it because that's what we've been doing. And people are invested emotionally into that. And when we tell them, no, we're not going to do that anymore because it doesn't help us achieve the vision, they go into shock. And they're like, what? Imagine the difference, though, if we sit down and say, look, we're trying to achieve the vision. And we only need to do those things that are going to help us move toward that vision. And so we filter every decision. It will inform our decision making. It's a powerful thing. Number two, it will help navigate change and it will challenge the status quo. So the idea is change is coming because you can't meet these needs without change. But if you have a vision, you can navigate that change so much more effectively. Because now you've got a vision to point people to. That's the reason we're making these changes. They're going to help us achieve this vision. And here's the thing. The comfort zone is noted as being the place where the status quo rules. And you can challenge that status quo, and you can challenge your comfort zone when you have a vision, because you can't stay still. You got to move. Number three, it promotes greater unity and motivation. You know, to me, my dad used to say, an idle mind is the devil's workshop, and idle hands are the devil's tools. But if you have a vision, people can't remain idle. You've got to be active. You've got to be doing things to move toward achieving that vision. And so it will promote greater unity and motivation for people to get up and do something. Now, for me personally, I tell people that the vision that you have in the church needs to be your personal vision. We'll talk about that more in just a second. but it inspires people towards this just cause. I'm a big fan of Simon Sinek. I like his material. I like reading his books. He's written several. I don't know if he's come out with one since the last one I read, which was in 2020. But the last book that I read from him was called The Infinite Being, and it's really a good book. But in that, he talks about this concept of a just cause. And he describes or defines a just cause as a specific vision of the future that does not yet exist, but it is so appealing that people are willing to sacrifice in order to achieve it. Wouldn't that be awesome? Now, the example he used was life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That was the just cause for this country. And you think about, over the last 2 centuries of time, how many people have died so that we could have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, let me tell you, I think we have a just cause in the church that's far greater than anything this country could come up with. Something that we would be willing to give our lives to achieve. We just need to figure out what that is. And that vision will inspire us toward that just cause, and it will provide us with a better future. My great-great-great-grandfather, when he first came to this country, in his mind, I don't know if he had a vision, but I know he wanted a better future for his son than he had. And my great-great-grandfather wanted the same for my great-grandfather. And my great-grandfather wanted the same for my grandfather, and my grandfather wanted the same for my dad. And for me personally, I think my dad wanted the same for me. I certainly wanted that for my kids. And I think we're all in that same boat. We want the future to be better for our children than it is for us. And so when we think about the church, don't you want the church 15, 20, 50 years from now to be better than it is now? The only way that's going to happen is if you have a vision for it. It will not happen by accident. You've got to see it, and you have got to plan to achieve it. That's the only way it will happen. This doesn't happen simply because we are in a building, meeting in a specific location, and that somehow people are just going to flock in here. There are too many options for people in the community. Why us? I'm going to talk about that in just 1 second. In his book, Andy Stanley writes about making vision stick. Now, the interesting thing about this book is he doesn't tell you how to write a vision. He just tells you how to make it stick. And the number one thing he says is it has to be memorable. It has to be memorable. Now, I attended the church at Bear Valley and worked there for 8 years with the school. And when we first moved there in 2008, they were rolling out a vision for the church that they had worked on for 2 years. Now, when you hear what I'm about to tell you, you'll understand why it took them 2 years. One of the men who was helping them write this vision statement had this concept in mind that a vision is about a picture of the future. And a picture is worth 1,000 words. And so they made their vision statement literally 1,000 words to the word. In 2016, the elders were like, wow, 8 years and we've done nothing. Duh. Nobody even knew what the vision statement was. A vision statement needs to be memorable. I'm going to share with you some vision statements this afternoon, several of which, all of them that come from congregations I work with, but several of them I think are really, really good. And primarily because they're really easy to remember. Now, you got to be careful. You don't want to substitute craftiness or creativity for what's really legitimately addressing the need. Because a lot of times people try to come up with words that rhyme and make it catchy, and they kind of sacrifice the whole point of what the vision is about. But I'll share with you some of those this afternoon. It needs to be something that's memorable, and it needs to be repeated regularly. What I tell people is you need to put a banner. Once you have your vision statement, put a banner above the pulpit. You need to have it in every bulletin you hand out. It needs to be the signature of every email that you send out. One congregation made these little 5x7 magnets with their vision statement on it. They told people to put it on their refrigerator so that every time they went to the refrigerator to get a drink or something to eat, they saw the vision statement. When you go to their website, it's the first thing that comes up. I mean, it's just like bang! Everywhere people turned, they had bookmarks for their Bibles. They had their vision statement on all those things. They wanted people to know the vision statement. So it needs to be memorable, it needs to be repeated regularly, and it needs to be celebrated. One of my favorite things that Andy Stanley says in his book is that what gets celebrated gets repeated. My wife and I recently had this conversation. I don't know when or why. We were talking about the church that I used to be at Greenbrier and some of the challenges there, because one of the elders had this mindset that you were not to honor people. You honor God. And so they celebrated nothing. No achievement. Nobody's names were mentioned from the pulpit, to encourage them. None of that stuff. And he always turned to Luke 17. That whole concept about, at the end of the day, we're just unworthy servants, that we've only done what we were supposed to have done. I'm like, okay, first of all, that's not the context. And secondly, why on earth did you not read Romans? Give honor to whom honor is due. I mean, if you don't want people to repeat what they're doing, then don't celebrate. But if you want them to repeat it, then celebrate it. Celebrate every step toward the vision. People need to be encouraged and to know that what they're doing is valuable and it's making a difference, and maybe it will encourage others to do the same. But we need to celebrate achievement and progress because it's exciting. We need to build momentum. If you want to stifle momentum, then don't acknowledge it, don't celebrate it, and say nothing about it. And what will happen is you'll go right back into that comfort zone and nothing will take place. So celebrate it. And then this is the piece that I was talking about. Embrace it personally. Once you have a vision for the congregation here, as an individual, you need to embrace it personally. It should become your personal vision. That every day when you get up, with every breath you draw into your lungs, that your life that day is going to be about achieving this vision. Because how exciting it is and how challenging it is and how it's going to help the church. When it comes to developing your vision statement, there are a couple of things that I want to point out to you, and then we're going to spend some time here talking about this. The first part is why. Now, I don't know about your kids when they were growing up, but mine, from a very young age, that was their favorite question. Why? On the few occasions that I was wise enough to explain to them why, they were fully satisfied with the answer. But you know how kids are. It's like, well, we're going to do it because of this. Why? Well, because of this. Why? I mean, every time we go through that routine, they were always saying, but why? But why? Once we satisfied the reason, and this idea of because I told you to never worked. They wanted to know why. But the church wants to know why. And let me tell you, there are a lot of things in regards to this. Frederick Nietzsche made the statement that he who has a why to live for can bear almost anyhow. When people understand why we're doing what we do, then they will make whatever sacrifices needed to achieve it. Because they see the value in it. There's purpose. But let me tell you, where we're at right now in the church is people do not see value and purpose in just assembling to do the same things week after week after week after week. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. I'm just saying that a lot of our younger generation are asking questions in regards to why do we do what we do in the same order. We just rotate the songs around and hear a different message. Why are we doing that? And we haven't been very good at giving them answers to that. So how do you discover your why? What is your purpose? Do you know what your why is as the church? So I'm going to give you just like 1 minute. I don't want you to take a long time because people overthink this all the time. So I don't want you to overthink it. I want you to take about 1 minute and I want you to discuss at your table just real quick. Why do you exist? What is your purpose as the Ovilla Church of Christ? Does that make sense? So write down, what is your purpose? Why do you exist? One answer, each table, 1 minute. Go ahead.
Father,
service level we do. But this level we're going to do. This is what it's
30 seconds.
Church is, no, we're talking about the church. I see the serve every day. Church kids on Wednesday. That's what we're talking about. Basically. We're not perfect, that's not. We have reason. I don't agree with this.
It's an interesting question, isn't it? Okay. I can already tell you're overthinking. Okay. What is your purpose? What is your why? Why do you exist? I want to start with you.
We said connect with God and connect with each other.
All right. Connect with God and each other. That's one. You got, ladies, give me another. What'd you have?
Praise God.
Say it again.
Praise God.
Praise God. Okay. Ladies, what'd y'all decide?
We said to encourage each other to be Jesus in the world.
All right. Where do we get to here? Ladies, you're in the middle.
Love.
Love. Okay. Guys, what you got here?
Make disciples.
Make disciples. Okay. And here.
Said further the church.
Further the church. Okay. So, not to play the child here, but why do we need to connect with God and each other? Why do we praise God? Why do we need to encourage each other to be Jesus in the world? Why do we love? Why do we make disciples? Why are we trying to further the church or advance the church?
For an ultimate goal to get to heaven.
Oh, okay.
What was that?
To get to heaven, the ultimate goal of getting to heaven.
God asks us to.
God asked us to.
Because that's what our initial design and purpose was. We were designed to connect with God.
Okay, because our initial design and purpose. And here's the thing. But why would all of these be to ultimately get us to heaven? Why would it be? What was it you said? Oh, because God asked us. Why would God ask us to do those things? See, I'm continuing trying to drive home a specific reason for you to think about in regards to why are these things so important or essential? I mean, why?
He told us to do most of those, that's command.
That's true, but why would He do that? Why would He command us to do those things?
Make disciples.
I think it goes back to,
Hold on just a second.
I think it goes back to because we were created to be in a relationship with Him from day one.
Okay, we were created to be in a relationship with Him from the very beginning. And you said to save souls. Why would we want to save souls? What's so important about that?
I don't know if this is the way it could be said most effectively, but because it's good for us to do these things.
Okay.
It's going to make us feel better, then it might make someone else feel better about it, and it's kind of a contagious thing.
True, and I like that. That's good. I mean, it does. It makes us feel better. It's going to make the other person feel better, obviously. You remember the retired CEO that I told you about from Western Union? He came in to class one day, and he kind of went through this whole process, which I thought, what is he driving at? You know, what was he? He kept asking why, and we don't have time to continue to vet this thing down. But he gave the class 2 words. And when he said those 2 words, it made such perfect sense. Eternity matters. You want to know why we connect with God? Is because eternity matters. Eternity matters. The reason why we praise God and encourage others to be Jesus in the world, the reason why we love, the reason why we make disciples, the reason why we want to advance the church and we want to be in heaven is because eternity matters. Ultimately, that's the core why behind what we do. Now, here's another question that I'd like for you to think about. And I'm going to give you just a couple minutes. We can't spend a lot of time or we're going to be late for lunch. We can't do that. So here's the thing. Why would someone who is unchurched, somebody in this community, not somebody that's going to the church down the road here or some, at some point we run out of people that are involved in religious organizations kind of like us. And we can't reach them anymore. But somebody who's unchurched, somebody in this community that doesn't really know anything about the Bible, doesn't really know anything about these other religious groups, why would they choose to come here? Why would they make the choice to say, I'm going to go to the Ovilla Church of Christ? So, I can give you just a couple of minutes to write down your 2 or 3 answers, and then I'm going to put them up here. But why would they make that choice? For needs? Yes, indeed. It's funny you say that because I'm going to talk about that in this session. So just about a minute, and then we're going to share what answers we have. It's a tough question to answer. Now, why would they stay? That's my next question. The question is, why would they come? Why would they make their choice? Yeah. The first time, why would they make it? Yeah, I'm going to go there. Okay, so let's share our answers here. To me, this is one of the most challenging questions to consider. Why would they choose to come here? So let's start here, ladies. Give me, why do you think, don't look at me like that. You're like, can you start somewhere else? Well, just give me one. Why would they make the choice to come here?
They know someone.
Okay. And these guys over here going, oh, we already had that. So let me put it this way as well, because this is kind of part of that. They're invited by someone they know. So you know someone, they're unsure, you invite them, they come. So there's a connection with somebody there is one reason. Give me another one that you all have.
That's what they said. That's what we said, connection.
Okay, they're connected. Do you all have a different answer?
We said they might have a need.
Okay, so there may be a need. Could be physical, could be spiritual, could be there's a need that exists. What do you guys have back there?
Friendliness was one of them. Yeah, spiritual connection.
A spiritual connection? Okay, spiritual need. What do you guys have?
We had all those answers.
Okay.
We had the need, spiritual
Okay.
need.
Okay, so there's a need, spiritual, physical, some kind of need. Do y'all have 4? Did you have some other stuff? What else do you have?
Well, we said maybe they've seen how you live.
Yes.
No,
Okay.
I,
That could be this.
Yeah.
They know someone, they've seen how they live, want to come here. Okay.
yeah. So that was, and then we, the need was.
Okay.
Yeah.
See, here's the thing. This is such a challenging question to ask. And of course, I was asked the second question, and that is, why would they stay? I mean, that's the big question. Once they do make the decision to come here, why would they stay? And of course, that's going to be totally up to you guys and how you respond to them as someone who's new and visiting. How you respond to them will make all the difference in the world. Now, I'm going to explain to you a situation that took place. I was working with a church in Spokane Valley, Washington. Congregation about 50. They had 5 elders. How do you like those numbers? Aren't those good? 10 people per elder. That would be a sweet gig. So they had 5 elders, and the elders, and we worked through a vision thing, and they wanted me to come back and to work with them about how to really get connected to people in the community, because this was an intriguing question to them. Why would somebody choose to come there? And why would they stay? The staying part wasn't the problem. The problem was getting them there. How would they go about getting people to come? Well, the first thing I did was I went and looked at their website. And I told them, your website's a train wreck. Nobody's going to come if they visit your website, because all you've got is all this content. You've got these 45-minute sermons on there that nobody's going to listen to. I said, nobody's going to come. If they think they're going to have to sit through a 45-minute sermon when they come, they are not coming. And see, people will check you out online before they check you out in person, every time. I mean, if it's somebody that doesn't really know anything about you, they're going to go to your website first. If you don't have one, we already put it up there. That's a need. You got to have a website, because people are looking online to see about who you are. Let me encourage you, like I encourage them, is don't put those long sermons on there. Put maybe a 1-minute sermon bite. I mean, just 1 minute of something that's intriguing, that's interesting, that when they hear it, they're like, I'd like to go hear more about that. And so just put those 1-minute things, and don't put a lot of them. I mean, they're not going to sit there and spend 30 minutes listening to 1-minute sound bites. But they'll listen to a minute. So find the most intriguing, the most interesting couple of things and put those on there. But the biggest thing you need to put on there are pictures. Pictures of kids having fun, pictures of activities that they're involved in. People are looking for a place that has something for their kids. And if you don't have anything, they're not going to come, because that's what they're looking for. Most older folks are already connected somewhere because of the previous generation. They were more actively religious than they are now in the new generation coming up. And a lot of people identify with that, what's that group called? The nuns. They're not really associated with anybody. And so a lot of them may be looking, but the question is, what are they going to find when they go to your website? Because they're a very technologically skilled group of people. They're very savvy with technology. And so they're going to search you out first online. And what you put on that website, I would encourage you, if you don't have somebody in this congregation that does that for a living, hire somebody that does it for a living. that they know how to make it interactive, they know how to make it easy to find stuff on the website, and when people go there, they're going to see pictures of people. I would even encourage you to find one or two, not more than that, but one or two people who really are excited about and love this congregation, and let them do a 45-second clip that explains to people in the community when they go there why they love the Ovilla Church of Christ. Explain and let them do that. And don't let them get on there and say, because we preach the truth. I mean, every group in this town says the same thing. So why is that going to set us apart from anybody else? Talk about what you love. People want to know that they can connect to a relationship with people when they're here. We've got all kinds of people here. We've got older folks, we've got younger folks, we've got kids, we've got activities for the kids. I mean, let them explain the exciting things about this church that they love, so that when people go to the website and they watch that video clip, they're going to be like, dude, we need to go check them out. And then once they come, you need to love them like there is no tomorrow.
Amen.
I mean, people say, well, you know, some folks, they're kind of introverted. If they made the step out of their house to come here, when they get out of the car, you need to meet them out there.
Amen.
I talked to a guy that is trying to revive a small congregation in Whitneyville, Tennessee. And he told me, he's 85 years old, he was trying to tell me that he grew up hearing his father tell him that the way you reach people is you've got to have their feet under your table, and you need to greet them when they get out of their car. He said that'll make them stay. So what that means is, if they get out of the car, you need to greet them out there before they ever come through the door. Don't wait for them to come in the door. I mean, if you see somebody that you don't know, you get to them right away. Where are you from? Why are you here? We're glad you're visiting. And if they're not from this community, that's okay. You still did a friendly thing. And then show them where classrooms are, where the classes are, all that kind of stuff that's going on. And then invite them to sit with you. Don't let them try to find a place. We want you to sit with us. And when service is over, we're going to take y'all to lunch. Get their feet under a table where you can eat a meal together. I'm going to explain more tomorrow during the Bible class why that's so important. But they need to know that the reason they stayed is because people love them. You need to ask two very evaluating questions. When you're thinking about developing your vision, you need to know your why, but you need to ask two evaluating questions. The first question is, do we see ourselves correctly? Now, I talked last night about the difference between image and reputation. We tend to see ourselves one way, and our community tends to see us a different way. If you want to truly see yourself correctly, I would encourage you to ask some people in this community what they know about the Ovilla Church of Christ. If they know nothing, that tells you what you need to be working on. And if they tell you negative things, then that tells you what you need to be working on. But you need to know what your reputation is, if you have one at all. Because that's going to be the biggest piece when you think about your vision and how that's going to impact this congregation and the direction you're going. You need to see yourself correctly. Let me ask you this. If the Ovilla congregation disappeared tomorrow, I mean, if it just vanished from this piece of property tomorrow, would anybody know? Would people in this community know if this church disappeared tomorrow? Perhaps the most important question is, would they even care? Would people in this community know if you disappeared, and would they care? Now, I'll just be honest with you. To me, those are the two most frightening questions to be honest about. Because I know from all the congregations I've been a part of, if they disappeared, nobody would know. And really, nobody would really care. And what that tells me is we're going to have to do some things differently if we're going to help others understand the value of the church. Now, the second evaluating question is this. Do we see our God correctly? Sometimes we tend to think, and my fear is that we put this box out here and we put God in it. And we tend to think that God is not going to do something because we've convinced ourselves that we can't do it. And I'll just be dead flat honest with you. In tomorrow's sermon, I'm going to talk about this more. We need to eliminate that word from our vocabulary. We can't do that. I met with a congregation, and it was that same group of elders where the elder got mad, and he was like, you know, he didn't like the word change. And so we're going to do this exercise after lunch where you're going to paint a picture of what you want this church to look like in 10 years. And I said, this is your chance to dream big. And so one of the guys in that group, he wrote down, he said, I'd like to see us be 700 people. And as soon as he said that, one of the elders said, we ain't never going to be that. The fire marshal will shut us down. And I just went, church. He's done. I mean, he has no concept of other than what they have right there. How sad to be so negative in a meeting where you're dreaming. This doesn't mean that's who you're going to be. But what if you went to 2 services and you became 700? But see, he couldn't see that. He was more, really, he was more interested in being combative to me because he didn't want me there. But that's a whole different story. But the thing is, do we see our God correctly? Do we know who our God really is? I mean, I love that verse in Ephesians 3, verse 20. To him who is able to do far more abundantly beyond all we ask or think, according to the power that works within us. Amen. Jesus took 12 men and turned the world upside down. And there are more than 12 men in this room. Do we see him correctly? Because if we get a glimpse of who our God really is, then there is no tiger we're unwilling to fight. No Goliath that we won't go to the battlefront against. Because we can do it with God.
Amen.
And then, do we know what success looks like? Now, this is a tricky question because the term success is very subjective. How one person defines success will be totally different than someone else. But do you know what success looks like for you as a congregation? I know a lot of missionaries in this world that are losing support because churches this side of the pond tend to not see them as being a fruitful area. How do we measure success in the church? See, we don't like to admit it. But the real, say it again? Number of baptisms. And the thing is we hold people overseas more accountable for that than we do our own people. I mean, our own congregations don't grow more than 1 or 2 a year. And usually those are people from inside the congregation that are kids growing up. And yet what we do is we hold these missionaries overseas accountable for having multiple baptisms, or it's not a fruitful area, we're going to pull their support. But the problem with that is we don't understand what success really means. I did my dissertation on the work in Cambodia, and I'll tell you what, it was frightful to learn about that country. I mean, they're nearly 98% Buddhist. Now you try to go into a country that's 98% Buddhist that believes, one, that if you become a Christian, you are betraying your country. You're a Benedict Arnold to your country because it's the national religion, is Buddhism. And so you're betraying your country if you accept Christianity. 2, you're saying that your ancestors, you're walking away from your ancestors. And so your family will, 1, either disown you and beat you for the decision you've made to not be a part of their family. Because it's a family religion. I mean, when you start putting all those things together, is it any surprise that Christianity in its broadest definition is only 0.4% of the population? Not even 0.5% of the population in Cambodia is Christian. And we pull their support over there because they're not having multiple baptisms every year. I'm like, if we had to face the same circumstances in this country, it would sure change our view. But do we even know what success looks like? I love John Maxwell's definition. Success is having those who know you best respect you the most. Isn't that cool? I love that definition. It's having those who know you best respect you the most. That's success. I think that's awesome.
Keep that up there.
Keep that up there. I'll just give you a copy of the slides. How's that? Be fair enough. You've been taking all those notes. You're like, man, you're going to give us the slide. Your vision needs to be concrete as opposed to abstract. If you're using terms, for example, think about this. We want to be a great church. Well, that's not a great vision statement because it's so subjective. How do you define great? I mean, what do you have to do to be great? Well, we don't have to do anything different. We're already great. And so really, that's just not a good vision statement. You want your vision statement to be concrete. And so I'm going to encourage you after lunch when you work on writing it to not think in terms that are abstract or absolute. You want your terminology to be very concrete, very specific, so that you don't have to define it for people. And then, and this is the biggest thing that I'm going to ask you after lunch when you write your vision statement, is it challenging? Is it energizing? And is it meaningful? Your vision statement should be challenging. It should be exciting. It should give you energy. It should get you up in the morning because you want to achieve it. And it should be meaningful. And so I'm going to ask that question. When you're writing your vision statements after lunch, and we've got a couple more steps that you're going to work on first, but when you write that vision statement, I want to know, does it challenge you? Does it energize you? And is it meaningful to you? Because if the answer to all three of those is yes, then you've got the right statement. If the answer is no to any one of the three, you got to reword it. Somehow. It may not be abandon it and start over, but you may just have to reword it. And so as you think about writing your vision statement, we've got two more pieces we're going to work on after lunch that you're going to spend a little more time in your groups working on. You can be thinking about it now. We're going to first of all talk about where you are now. And you're going to list out, you're going to give a description of the congregation here at Ovilla as it is now. You're going to look at all of those things like programs and outreach and all that kind of stuff. You're going to list that all out. And then we're going to talk about what you want the church to look like in 10 years. And so you're going to list all that stuff out. We're going to put it all up here. We're going to hang it on the doors over there. And you're going to be able to see all of that. And then after that, I'm going to give you just a couple more things. And then you're going to write your vision statement. And I'm going to pull all of this that we've talked about together at that time so that you have some perspective. And I'll give you some samples. We'll talk about those samples and what was going on in those congregations that they wrote those vision statements based on their needs and why that happened. In the meantime, I would encourage you to take pictures of these needs because they're going to factor into the development of your vision statement. And we'll talk about how that works here. In fact, I'm going to give you a sample of a congregation that has their needs. I'm going to list out their needs up there for you, show you how they found their threads and how they developed their why, and how they developed their vision statement. And I'm going to show you their mission statement only for the purpose of helping you see that the mission statement has to align with your vision. It doesn't do something separate. It has to be the what that's going to help you achieve who you want to become. And so we'll talk about that after lunch. All right. Turn it over to you, sir.
We don't have food on here yet, so we'll find out very quickly, but let's offer prayer for our lunch and dinner. Let's offer prayer together. Father in heaven, we're thankful that we have time that we can have food together and just go ahead and spend some time talking about what we've been going through, what we've been discussing, and to continue with this focus. Continue with the nourishment of not just physical nourishment, but the nourishment we have here for continuing this congregation into the future and to really share the gospel to others around us. In your son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.